At that time, we ask that you use the webinar feature to raise your hand to let us know that you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. CARB staff will then unmute your line. For those of you participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand. You may also use the question and answer box to ask questions. We'll remind you of these questions throughout the workshop. Today's workshop will start with the session providing an overview of the clean transportation incentives, the final state budget, and the funding allocations we are considering. At this time, we will also provide information on the revised schedule for this year's funding plan, as well as walk through what the funding plan will look like this year, since it will be a bit different than previous years. Next, we'll go over some changes that staff are considering to project criteria for the projects you see listed on the slide and that are included in the discussion document. We will then take a short break and resume to discuss the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. After that, we will move to the Clean Truck and Bus Voucher Incentive Project, or HVIP, and the programmatic changes staff are considering in greater detail. While we will provide time for questions and comments throughout the morning, we will end the day by providing half an hour for comments before doing a quick recap and next steps. Please note that all these times are approximate. If we finish one section early, we will continue on with the next section. With that, let's go ahead and get started with some background and an overview of the funding allocations we are considering. CARB maintains a robust portfolio of incentive programs for clean transportation that complement and support the state's regulatory approaches. Incentives will play a critical role in addressing the state's various air quality and climate change goals, including the executive order signed by the governor last week that requires all new cars and passenger trucks sold in California to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, and that all operations of medium and heavy-duty vehicles be 100% zero-emission by 2045 where feasible. These investments also support the development of advanced technologies, provide benefits to low-income and disadvantaged communities, support efforts to create truly sustainable communities, and promote economic growth and job creation within the state. Traditionally, the Clean Transportation's Incentives Funding Plan has been comprised of two distinct funding sources: low carbon transportation and the Air Quality Improvement Program, or AQIP. These two sources are only a portion of CARB's broader portfolio of funding programs that support the deployment of clean transportation technologies. Each program within the portfolio plays a unique role and has different goals and priorities. For example, the Farmer program focuses on achieving emission reductions in the agricultural sector. Carl Moyer focuses on achieving cost-effective emission reductions of criteria pollutants such as NOx, and the Community Air Protection Program is driven by community goals. Collectively, these programs fit together to support California's multiple near-term and long-term public health, air quality, and climate change goals. The programs within the clean transportation incentives play a unique role in CARB's portfolio by supporting the deployment of passenger vehicles through projects like CVRP and Clean Cars for All, and also focus on investing in the innovative, advanced technologies that are needed to meet our 2030 and 2050 climate goals. And outside of CARB, other federal, state, and local agencies have complementary funding sources as well. Examples of these include the California Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program and the Strategic Growth Council's community-based projects. We coordinate with our sister agencies on these investment programs regularly. The Clean Transportation's incentives fund a number of projects within three broad categories: CVRP, Clean Transportation Equity Investments, and heavy-duty vehicle and off-road equipment investments. These investments have been instrumental in California leading the nation in ZEV deployments, accelerating the development and commercialization of advanced clean technologies, and in developing innovative, equity-focused projects that bring clean mobility options to residents of low-income and disadvantaged communities. We won't be talking about all of the investments you see here today, but instead we'll focus on those investments which we are considering making changes to or have significant updates to share. Before we move on, I do want to give an update on CORE, the new Clean Off-Road Equipment Voucher Incentive Program. CORE launched in February of this year to incredible success. CORE currently includes eligible equipment from 13 different manufacturers and over 49 models, showing just how much growth has occurred for zero-emission equipment in the off-road industry. The project also quickly demonstrated that there is significant demand for this type of zero-emission equipment. After committing all $44 million of available funding to over 300 pieces of equipment, CORE closed to new voucher requests in August. The total voucher requests received up to that point were double the funding available in the program. We had initially considered making changes to CORE and had included it on the workshop agenda, but we have decided that it would be more prudent to wait until more funding is available so that we can ensure that changes are strategic and targeted to the appropriate funding level. CORE staff are available today to answer questions about the project. The first of the two funding sources typically included in clean transportation incentives is the Air Quality Improvement Program, or AQIP. AQIP was created by Assembly Bill 118 in 2007 and reauthorized in 2013 by Assembly Bill 8. AQIP focuses on reducing criteria pollutants and diesel particulate emissions with concurrent reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. These appropriations are based on revenue from vehicle registrations as part of the smog abatement fee. This year, the budget included $28.64 million for AQIP. The second funding source included in the clean transportation incentives is low carbon transportation investments. Low carbon transportation funds are annually appropriated by the legislature as part of the cap and trade expenditure plan. However, this year, the legislature has deferred action on the fiscal year 2020-2021 cap and trade expenditure plan, including low carbon transportation. Even though the low carbon transportation appropriation has not yet been finalized, CARB has decided to move forward with the development of a funding plan so that we can get the AQIP funds to the projects that critically need them and so that the state can begin to realize the benefits of these funds as soon as possible. Because there is not yet a final low carbon transportation appropriation, this year's funding plan will look different than previous years. We plan to include our proposals for the AQIP allocation and recommended program refinements for those projects that are receiving this funding this year or have remaining funds and would benefit from changes to project criteria. Project changes considered by staff are to address a variety of goals, such as streamlining requirements between complementary programs and clarifying requirements to make them more user-friendly, changing requirements and eligibility criteria to enable projects to stretch remaining dollars further, and addressing necessary administrative changes. The funding plan will also include updates to the SB 1275 light-duty ZEV market findings and the SB 1403 long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. The allocations and recommendations we are considering for this funding plan, while limited, are focused on continuing the momentum that has been built in previous years so that when additional funding becomes available, we're able to accelerate our efforts. I'll start us off by reviewing our preliminary recommendation for the AQIP allocation. For the past several years, all AQIP funding has been directed to the Truck Loan Assistance Program, and we believe it has sufficient funds available to meet demand this year. As a result, we are considering directing AQIP funds to other projects. Our preliminary recommendation is to allocate $25 million of the AQIP appropriation to HVIP and to place the remaining $3.64 million in a reserve for fiscal uncertainty. In determining which projects to allocate AQIP dollars to, we considered which of the ongoing projects were most in need of an immediate influx of funds. While it's clear that there is continued need for investments in all project categories, staff recommends allocating the AQIP appropriation to HVIP. HVIP is in critical need of additional funding, having been closed to new voucher requests since November 2019, after requests exceeded the total fiscal year 2019-2020 funding allocated to the project. HVIP plays a critical role in advancing clean technologies and preparing the market for regulations such as advanced clean trucks and innovative clean transit. HVIP not only achieves greenhouse gas reductions, but reductions in criteria pollutants such as nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, meeting the goals of AQIP. We will discuss this allocation in HVIP in greater detail later this morning. In addition to the HVIP allocation, we are recommending to place $3.64 million in a reserve for revenue uncertainty. The AQIP appropriation is based off projected motor vehicle fee revenue, and CARB has taken this measure before when there was revenue uncertainty. Staff will evaluate revenue in early 2021. If revenue is sufficient, CARB will allocate the $3.64 million, or however much is available, according to project need, and will hold additional public work groups to discuss this allocation as necessary. More detail is provided on staff's considerations in the discussion documents, and we will be walking through our plan for the HVIP allocation later today. Before we move on with the presentation, I'd like to provide a quick overview of what the rest of the process will look like for the funding plan. We anticipate that the proposed funding plan will be posted for a formal 30-day public comment period by November 6th, and that the board will consider the funding plan at its meeting on December 10th and 11th. We're operating under a compressed schedule this year, so if you have comments that you'd like to make prior to this formal public comment period in November, we ask that you make them today or that you reach out to staff as soon as possible. And if you have any questions on who the appropriate staff is, you're more than welcome to reach out to me and I will help direct you. With that, we'll open up the floor for a short discussion period for questions on this introductory material and the allocations we are considering. However, we will have more time to discuss potential project changes and the HVIP allocation in greater detail at those respective sections. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the webinar feature to raise your hand. If you're participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand. Staff will announce the name of the commenter and then unmute your line to allow you to make your comment or ask your question. Please introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation. You may also type your question into the question and answer box. We will alternate between taking verbal questions and reading and responding to those in the question and answer box. So with that, I will turn it over to Lisa Williams, who will be helping us moderate questions today.
Thanks, Andrea. I have two folks right now, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name. That goes for everybody. Okay, the first person is Abbas Gudarzi. I've now enabled your mic, and so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Yes, good morning, and I thank you so much. I appreciate your information provided and the support that CARB has provided. My comment and my question is that when is CARB going to specifically include in all of these taxpayer-funded program how the program focuses on the California industry and California workforce and California job growth? Because right now, we, the taxpayer, we are in Torrance, California, we are the manufacturers of powertrain, and basically we are competing against subsidized other companies from other states and other nations that they come and buy in and subsidize to take over our business, to take over our market, and California is the main focus for them. Whether it's Canada, that we cannot compete for Canadian programs, whether it's Norway, whether it's Japan, it makes no difference. So I would like very much to see in every single CARB program that is funded by taxpayer, that you guys include a section of how you're going to ensure that that taxpayer's money eventually going to roll back into the California community to help California with their job, because we are losing our industry, we are losing our market, we are losing our workforce, we are losing our basically means of life. And yet we are the one who funded it. So I would appreciate if you take that into account and include it. It's not just you guys, it's for CARB, because CARB does have a very, very, I am a strong supporter of CARB. Thanks for the leadership over decades, okay? But at some point, CARB is gonna say, okay, yes, I have a mission of cleaning the air for California and also be the leader in the world, which is good. But at some point, it's gonna say I need to be accountable to taxpayers. So then this is benefiting the communities, whether advantage, disadvantage, that's one thing. But it's actually helping California and US to be a player in this green industry. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. The next person is Bill McGavern. I have unmuted your mic, so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Thanks. Good morning. Bill McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air. And I just wanted to say that we agree with the staff proposal to put this AQIP funding into HVIP. Obviously, there are a lot of places that it would be worthwhile to spend the funding, but with the great demand for the HVIP vouchers, and also the fact that HVIP really supports important regulations that CARB has recently adopted, including advanced clean trucks and the innovative clean transit rule. So therefore, we support the recommendation. We also agree with putting some limitations on HVIP in terms of reducing voucher amounts and voucher limits. And I know you'll be talking more about that later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And Melanie Lewis, I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Hi guys, Andrea, that was an amazing presentation. You made all this sound pert and fun. I was hoping you could tell me, please, you said CORE is doing very well with its zero emissions equipment. Do you consider food trucks, an off-the-road vehicle?
So this is David Chen here at ARB. I'll take that question. So food carts are not eligible in CORE. CORE focuses on kind of heavy freight equipment, generally speaking, zero emission equipment. Right now, CORE, the only eligible categories in CORE are terminal tractors, transport refrigeration units, large forklifts, container handling equipment, airport cargo loaders, wide body aircraft tugs, rail car movers, aircraft ground power units, mobile power units, and mobile shore power cable management systems.
Refrigerated units would count, David?
Transport refrigeration units, yeah, the ones that kind of go on the trailers.
Okay, and then do you work with non-California based companies that have been working with transport refrigerated units from other states and that are now looking to establish themselves in California, or is this more specific to Californian based companies?
So for the fleet making the purchase, they have to be in California, and the operation of the equipment has to be in California, but the manufacturer does not necessarily have to be in California.
So the fleet has to be in California. The manufacturers can be from anywhere. Thank you, David.
Sure.
Okay, the next person with their hand raised right now is Rajiv Shah. I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment here, and really appreciate ARB's leadership on all of these programs and the funding support you're providing. My name is Rajiv Shah from FreeWire Technologies, and I just wanted to weigh in and urge ARB to consider providing additional funding for off-road equipment through CORE or other programs. I think with the great interest and sort of oversubscription for the CORE vouchers, you've seen the success of that program. We're a small manufacturer located in a disadvantaged community in San Leandro, exactly the type of California business that I think ARB should be trying to support with some of its funds where it can. I would also suggest that if CORE can be expanded beyond just freight applications, I know that originally the enabling or authorizing legislation and appropriations tied it to freight, but if there is a way to provide funding that doesn't only limit its application to freight, there are a number of other off-road uses. I think the last commenter kind of alluded to food trucks, as well as you know, various other applications in the agricultural context, etc. You know, this would be really welcome by FreeWire, and I guess my only question would be, is there any prospect of adding more funding through CORE or some other mechanism for these off-road applications?
So this is David Chen again. So at the program level, we definitely see value in expanding the scope of CORE to other industries, other types of applications. But you know, we as you mentioned, we were limited in this kind of first iteration of CORE by the funding we received, and so. You know, I would say it really would depend on the appropriation of the dollars. But at the program level, we do see value in expanding it.
And I guess one question I would ask is, would it be even possible for AQIP funding, you know, some portion of it to be sort of allocated towards CORE or a CORE-like program?
I don't think I'm suited to answer that question specifically. I don't know all the details of AQIP. I don't know if there's anybody, other panelists that
Hi.
respond to that.
Yeah, I can chime in, David. This is Lisa McCumber. You know, we did consider how we can look at the AQIP funds and ensure that it's reaching those projects that need the funding the most. And it is a challenge. We've got significant need on the heavy duty on-road side, and we've got significant need on the heavy duty off-road side. HVIP has been around a long time. We are working really hard, especially now with the governor's new executive order, in ensuring that we find ways to continue to promote and support ZEVs across the state. And so because HVIP has been out of money for quite a while, and the demand on that program is pretty significant, and it's a program that's been running for a really long time, we feel that this year, for this particular pot of funds, that's really kind of the right place. Both programs have a huge magnitude of need, and dividing it up even and providing just small bits to either of them wouldn't really get at the need for either of those projects yet. So we're kind of holding out and hoping to see what happens with the new legislative year and what funding comes through low carbon transportation to provide funding to all the projects that we want to fund. Remember, right now we are working with just one small pot of AQIP, but we do expect at some point we will see funds for low carbon transportation. And when we do hope to get these programs up and running, expanded, and moving forward again.
Got it. And I totally appreciate what you're saying. I guess my only respectful suggestion would be, you know, to the extent that there can be some flexibility, and in recognition of sort of the need across both different spaces, just a reconsideration that some portion goes to the off-road. But I also hear you on the fact that HVIP has gone without funding for some time. My understanding was CORE supported some of that even this year with a portion of its funding, but I guess we loved the CORE program. It really helped us survive as a business through this year, through the trying times that we faced, especially early this year. And we really thank the Air Resources Board for that support, and hope it can continue in some form in 2021 and beyond.
Thanks. Yeah, we will definitely continue to consider the best way to use the AQIP funds during this time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And if I could remind folks to please state your affiliation. So
And oh, sorry, Lisa, can we take one more from the raised hands, and then we'll move over to the question and answer box for a little bit?
Absolutely.
Great.
Sure thing. Okay, so the next one here is Sue Dexter. I have enabled your mic, and you can unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Thank you so much. My name is Sue Dexter. I'm from the University of Southern California. And my question has to do with the demonstrations of the heavy-duty zero-emission trucks. First of all, I'm very interested and happy to see that money is being allocated to move the tech forward and also include fleets in analyzing the impact to operations. But this is currently, completely fleet-based, and I was wondering about your thoughts in getting owner-operators more involved in this, since they make up a huge percentage of the Southern California truck force, especially for the port operations. I know this is tricky, but it's necessary. And your comments or considerations for this, I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
Good morning, this is Peter Christensen. Okay, if I jump in on this one and get the conversation started at least?
Yes, thanks, Peter.
Great. So owner-operators, that's a great question. And I think we'll likely talk more about that this afternoon in the HVIP session. So I would just encourage you to make sure you stay with us and participate then as well. But it's very true that owner-operators, especially trucking fleets, are, they do have some special considerations when it comes to adopting advanced technologies and the need for incentives. And it's something that we look at across the portfolio. So we mentioned already the Carl Moyer program and the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program, Volkswagen Investments. All of those funding programs provide opportunities in different ways for owner-operator fleets. One in particular is the Truck Loan Assistance Program. I think that's really one of the opportunities right now that's particularly helpful to owner-operators, because it does provide that greater accessibility to loan assistance, to being able to access loan funding for cleaner truck purchases, both new and used. When it comes to newer technologies, that's certainly an opportunity as well. In some cases, depending upon the technology, that's a good fit, and depending upon the duty cycle needs of those fleets, it's a really important consideration. How far do they go? Where do they travel? Do they have access to fueling stations? Those kinds of things. So it's something that we're definitely looking at across the portfolio, and something that we have an eye on toward the future as well, as more and more of the advanced zero-emission technologies provide opportunities for those owner-operator fleets. So we'll definitely be talking more about that today, but thanks for teeing it up this morning.
All right, and to move us to some questions that we have received in the question and answer box. At first, I want to address a question that we received that was more on logistics of the question and answer box, which was asking us if we were able to consider comments generally in the question and answer box, or if you needed to actually make a verbal comment. So when we receive questions in the question and answer box, that is a valid way to submit them for general staff consideration. We'll also read a copy of the question and address it here at the webinar if appropriate. So I hope that responds to that question. The next question that I'll be answering is on how the recent executive order will affect the funding plan. And so many of you may know this past week or last week, the governor issued an executive order that puts forth this target of reaching 100% of new vehicle sales in California be of zero emission vehicles by 2035, as well as beginning to move over the off-road sector to zero emission, with drayage trucks being zero emission by 2035 and off-road equipment also by 2035, and all other medium and heavy duty vehicles being zero emission where feasible by 2045. So you will see this as something that we're considering as we're developing the funding plan, and being a reason that we're really focusing a lot of our investments on those zero emission pieces of equipment and vehicles. So you'll see that theme. That's been a goal of low carbon transportation for the past several years in the funding plan, and we'll be continuing that in these years moving forward, this year moving forward. All right. Let's see. So another question from here. Have you considered allocating $5 million of AQIP fund for zero emission port equipment commercialization? This is an important need for greenhouse gas reductions, toxic air contamination reductions, and criteria pollutants. Ports are also in AB 617 areas, yet there is a strong need for commercialization of unavailable port equipment. So we are certainly considering how we can best use the AQIP funds in a number of categories. HFIP, while not necessarily specifically for port equipment, does support some applications related to ports, such as drayage trucks, and a lot of other port equipment would fall under the core categories. Peter or David, would you like to add on to anything to that question? Or Michelle?
Yeah, I was going to actually steal a little bit of Michelle's thunder on this one and just put in a plug for the upcoming solicitation for zero emission drayage trucks. We have and we'll be talking about this more this afternoon as well, but we have a coordinated funding opportunity coming up that we're partnering with the California Energy Commission for $40 million in combined funding for zero emission drayage trucks. So that should be coming out in the near future. So please keep an eye out for that.
And Mark, I'm just going to add to what Peter said and just mention that, you know, we do have a very limited pot of funding this year, and we do have the 3-year long-term investment strategy, which will come up later on in this presentation, that does outline our need for support for the demo and pilot areas. And so really what you're seeing today is a culmination of staff work that has tried to prioritize the types of projects we have and who needs immediate funding now. And so the zero emission port equipment is certainly something that we're interested in and focused on, and that's still part of our long-term investment strategy. So I encourage you to stay tuned through the afternoon.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next question, we'll do 2 more questions from the question and answer box and then move back to the raised hands. So the next question, I'm from an OEM, Westward Industries, and would like to propose 3-wheeled motorcycles for municipalities for funding. Would I ask this at the end or now? We do also produce lithium-ion NEVs and are always competing against gas and diesel competitors. To clarify further, the ZEM category to include 3-wheelers have been excluded under CVC 400 parking enforcement vehicles. There are air quality benefits to be had.
Thanks, Chris. This is Lisa McCumber. We can definitely chat about this more offline and with the program staff for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and our other incentive programs. As you know, we've had some conversations in the past about these vehicles. Neighborhood electric vehicles were pulled out of the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project in recent years only because they weren't being produced in a way that met the requirements for participation. But once if you have NEVs available now with battery capacity and can meet the warranty requirements, we can certainly bring NEVs back into the CVRP program. But with regard to three-wheel motorcycles, there are some additional challenges with that. And so I can have staff kind of follow up with you on that further after or at the breaks.
All right, and the last question from the question and answer box for now. I'm not sure I heard the how yet. The EO speaks of 750 million per year. This is a very small part of that. Is the fund, if that is the fund source. If there is going to be a huge change in focus of investments, there should be an explanation of how this is going to occur.
So again, this is Lisa McCumber. Bruce, thank you for the comment. Like I said earlier, with regard to funding, AQIP is just a small piece. We absolutely recognize that. That is an annual appropriation that has already been allocated for this year. And again, there hasn't been action taken on low carbon transportation. And so that the 750 million is a combination of things. There's funding that goes to various state agencies to help support work done in the zero emission vehicle space, not just at CARB, but at our sister agency, the Energy Commission, through other transportation agencies as well. And so we are waiting to see what the budget says in that regard. And as Andrea said, what we're going to be covering today are the changes and things we can do with the funding that we have available. And then we do expect that the funding plan will cover some contingencies as it does every single year. And then once we've got a budget and budget sources and the programs identified through the budget, we would act then on how those projects would be funded. And then we do expect to be back next year with another funding plan with low carbon transportation and AQIP funds like we do each year.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Lisa Williams, can we take just 2 more questions from those with raised hands?
Absolutely, thanks, Andrea. Okay, and as a reminder, please state your affiliation. Matt Schrapp, I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Thank you and good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to make a comment here. I was hoping that we could make sure that with all the popularity of these recent online meetings that ARB is holding, especially in relation to how California benefits from this, either being from a manufacturer standpoint, a business standpoint, or a sensitive receptor standpoint, that when we talk about operation specifically related to either HVIP or any other program that's funded by AQIP, that you guys would, I guess, reiterate the California operational requirements. My understanding is that an HVIP is 100% California operation. So you don't have the ability to come into California, use the money that taxpayers have been, California residents rather, who are registering their vehicles or contributing to this, that these benefits are being realized here. I think that that would be helpful for context, especially because we have a lot of people who are maybe possibly new to these processes, or they just don't have anything better to do. One of the questions, not sure, but regardless, I think that that's important to reiterate that. And then also for the owner operator question about potential opportunities, and Peter had mentioned the truck loan assistance program. I believe that that is not receiving any type of allocation this year, but I'm hoping that you guys will be touching on it as we go through this to explain to folks, again, to these participants, how the program has benefited California-based businesses as well as the emissions reductions associated with that. Furthermore, about how that program will be continually supported even though there's no money coming towards it this year. So comments, question, all of the above here. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have one more hand raised right now. It's Nico Baukamp. Please state your affiliation. I've enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Good morning. This is Nico Baukamp with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. I had more of a contextual question. Can you remind us what the sunset is for AQIP in the context of last week's announcement, so we have a bit of an idea what's ahead, and also for consistency purposes? I think that question has been asked before by industry members about planning for the future and where this fits within in the planning and the certainties that they're looking for. Thank you.
So AQIP sunsets in 2023. The funds, so we've got a couple of years still of AQIP funds, but again, it is a small piece. Low carbon transportation funds. As everybody knows, this has been a very unique year, and the legislature decided to hold off on appropriating funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We hope to see action on that after the first of the year. But in all honesty, at this point in time, because of everything that has occurred this year, it's very challenging for us to predict exactly what role these programs are going to play in the long run. They're important programs. They're programs that we need to continue to move the ZEV program as a whole, light duty, heavy duty, on off-road forward. But until we've got kind of funding identified, and we have a better sense of what the overall perspectives are going to be for what that budget looks like, it's very hard for us to speak to that question. Do any of the other kind of program managers have anything that they'd like to add?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all we had for hand raising.
All right. Unfortunately, we do need to move on. I know that there are some additional questions in the question and answer box. As a reminder, we will have some time at the end of today to go through questions on anything. So we should be able to get back and address some of those. But I do want to turn it over to Raquel Leon now to take us through some of the changes that we are considering for various projects this year. Raquel?
Thank you, Andrea. And I'm going to apologize in advance. It's landscaping day down my street, so hopefully we can minimize that noise, but I'll keep going forward. And as Andrea mentioned, my name is Raquel Leon, and I'm the staff lead for CVRP. And today I'll be kicking off the next part of the workshop with a discussion on draft changes being considered for alignment for our vehicle purchase incentives and potential changes for CVRP and Clean Cars for All. Before we dive into a discussion on the draft changes for certain projects, I do want to provide a brief update on the long-term plan for the ZEV market. As many of you know, SB 1275, among other requirements, required CARB to include a long-term plan for CVRP and related programs in the fiscal year 2016-17 funding plan, and update that plan every 3 years. Although we are required to provide an in-depth update of the plan every 3 years, we have also provided minor updates to all components of the plan each year since. Additionally, as part of the supplemental report of the 2018-19 Budget Act, CARB is required to submit an annual supplemental report until January 1st, 2030, that includes a forecast of the total ZEV rebate investment necessary to reach the goal of placing at least 5 million ZEVs in service on California's roads. Development of the first report occurred alongside the development of the update to the long-term plan last year. The first report is provided in the fiscal year 2019-20 funding plan as part of Appendix C and will be updated in the funding plan annually until 2030. Since the introduction of the first light-duty long-term plan, the ZEV market has grown tremendously. However, events over the last 6 months have changed the ZEV market landscape and the new vehicle market as a whole. The inability to predict how the ZEV market will withstand the current economic instability will pose some challenges to accurately updating CVRP funding need projections and the long-term plan this year. We are continuing to review new data as it becomes available and analyzing the impacts the current economic and health crisis will have in updating assumptions, evaluations, and recommendations for the long-term plan. All that being said, there's still a need to get more ZEVs on California's roads. Incentives will continue to play a critical role in meeting California's ZEV deployment goals for the foreseeable future, especially as we try to encourage market growth from harder to reach segments, and doing so during times of economic uncertainty. Staff will present updated findings and suggestions to support the school in this year's funding plan after completing an analysis of all market and technology aspects. Now I will discuss aligning our vehicle purchase incentive programs. Staff has been working on income alignment across Clean Cars for All, CVRP, and CVA program to support one-stop shop and its implementation. Consistency across these equity programs should alleviate consumer confusion and make these programs more accessible for its target population and streamline the application process. In order to achieve consistency, staff is considering aligning income caps, household definition, and income definition. In terms of income alignment, staff is considering aligning income caps so that all equity programs have an income cap of 400% of the federal poverty level. This change would align the CVRP increase rebate with CARB's other equity vehicle purchase incentive programs. Staff is also considering an aligned household definition where these programs would all be based on the IRS household definition. The definition we are considering implementing is displayed on this slide and can also be found in the discussion document. CVRP currently includes traditional roommates as part of the household. However, if applicants do provide additional documentation, such as a lease, then roommate's income is not counted. The other equity programs use a similar definition. Changing the definition to the IRS household definition will alleviate confusion. Staff is also considering alignment of income definition and calculation, and that all equity programs use annual gross income as their qualifying income. All but 2 programs use gross income. Annual gross income is more representative of a household's income before taxes and any adjustments. Although these alignment efforts complement the one-stop shop pilot project, creating a successful streamlined application ultimately requires the equity project administrators to work closely and cooperatively with the one-stop shop grantee. Integration with one-stop shop ensures each equity project is easily accessible to the families and communities who are in the greatest need and stand to benefit the most from clean transportation and clean and affordable transportation. To that end, CARB is considering directing administrators of these projects to participate in one-stop shop. Now we'll move on to potential changes to CVRP that are being considered. Based on the current state of the economy, we do not want to further impact the ZEV market by introducing major changes to the project at this time. However, we are considering minor program adjustments that will make implementation easier down the road and allow for alignment with other clean transportation equity projects, such as financing assistance and Clean Cars for All. Staff is considering minor program adjustments, such as changing from using the Urban Dynamometer Driving Schedule, or UDDS, to determine all-electric range for plug-in hybrid vehicle eligibility, to using US EPA all-electric ranges, as this information is more readily available to consumers. Staff is considering using a minimum US EPA all-electric range of 25 miles, which is equivalent to the current minimum of 35 miles UDDS all-electric range. By using a US EPA all-electric range that is equivalent to the current UDDS requirement, there would be no impact on the current list of eligible vehicles and no impact to applicants. Additionally, we are looking to increase the minimum gross vehicle weight rating, or GVWR, for vehicle eligibility from 8,500 pounds GVWR to 10,000 pounds. Currently, vehicles that fall under this weight class are eligible for incentives through HVIP. As more non-commercial ZEVs are released in this weight class, it makes sense to provide incentives for them under CVRP, since HVIP is focused exclusively on commercial heavy-duty fleets, and CVRP is geared more toward personal use light-duty vehicles. As this is a change that impacts both CVRP and HVIP, CARB staff overseeing both projects are working together to ensure incentives are available for all weight classes. Staff is also considering increasing the income limit for increased rebates from a maximum of 300% of the federal poverty level to 400%, and directing the CVRP administrator to revise the definition of household and other definitions as necessary to align with other incentive programs. Lastly, we are considering an adjustment to the outreach requirement for the CVRP administrator. Currently, the administrator must spend at least 50% of rebate processing fees on outreach. This requirement allows the administrator to develop a very robust outreach program for CVRP, focusing on the new car-ready, low and moderate income, and dealer audiences. Now we would like to move more outreach funds to support continued outreach for increased rebates for low to moderate income consumers. To do this, we are considering changing the outreach requirement in the CVRP grant to specify that at least 50% of rebate processing fees spent on outreach must be focused on targeting low and moderate income consumers. Lastly, I will discuss some potential changes for Clean Cars for All, or CC4A. As many of you know, AB 630 codified the FMP Plus a pilot project into a formal standalone program with guidelines approved by the board in 2018. CARB staff have included detailed requirements in the discussion document. The requirements will be approved through the funding plan process as discussed last year. The requirements include increasing the incentive amount for mobility options from $4,500 to $7,500. This funding adjustment allows it to better compete with the replacement options available under this program. Incorporating the SB 400 requirement, which allows electric bikes as a mobility option in the CC4A program. And lastly, staff is considering directing CC4A administrators to align definitions for household size and what constitutes as income. Alignment with other low carbon transportation programs facilitates leveraging of funds among equity programs, as well as streamlines the application process for these programs. And with that, we'll open it up for questions and discussion on the program changes being considered for alignment, CVRP, and Clean Cars for All. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the webinar feature to raise your hand. If you are participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand. Staff will announce the name of the commenter and then unmute your line to allow you to make your comment or ask your question. Please introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation. And you may also type your question into the question and answer box.
Thanks, Raquel. We have a few folks with their hands up. And a reminder, please state your affiliation. Andy Schwartz, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Hey, good morning. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah. So my name is Andy Schwartz. I'm speaking today on behalf of Tesla. I first want to thank ARB for convening the workshop and for the opportunity to comment this morning. With regard to this segment of the presentation, Tesla respectfully asks that CARB completely phase out plug-in hybrids from CVRP in this funding plan. As evidenced by the governor's executive order last week, there's really increased urgency around phasing out fossil fuels, and we really think the program should focus exclusively on zero-emission solutions. At the risk of stating the obvious, for every dollar of funding that goes to plug-in hybrids, it's necessarily funding that goes that is eliminated or no longer available for zero-emission vehicles, which are unambiguously more consistent with the goals articulated in the governor's executive order. Phasing out hybrids would also be consistent with and fulfill CARB's commitment made in last year's funding plan to phase out plug-in hybrids. There is a pretty strong evidence-based case for graduating plug-in hybrids. In a study that was recently issued, actually this past weekend, by the ICCT, looking at over 100,000 plug-in hybrids, they found that plug-in hybrid fuel consumption and tailpipe CO2 emissions in real-world driving were on average 2 to 4 times higher than the certification standard. Furthermore, the real-world share of electric driving for plug-in hybrids was on average about half the share considered in the certification standard. I also understand that these results are consistent with CARB's own findings, which were discussed at the 916 ACC2 workshop. These findings included a finding that high power cold start emissions from trucks, SUVs, and plug-in hybrids are 170% higher than the certification standard. From our perspective, it's reasonable to assume, based on this, that the real-world electric range of CVRP incentivized plug-in hybrids is actually closer to something like 17 miles instead of the 35 that the that the program currently calls for. This is particularly troubling given the availability of long-range battery electric vehicles. And again, I think, sort of calls into question why the state would be using limited funds to support plug-in hybrids. So again, respectfully hope that ARB staff will consider fully removing plug-in hybrids from the program, as we do not see them as adequately fulfilling the urgent needs of the state with respect to GHG emissions or other pollutants. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, the next person is Eileen Tutt. I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Thank you. This is Eileen Tutt with the California Electric Transportation Coalition. And I just want to say that although I understand increasing the CVRP weight range, I'm wondering if we could do something like, and this is going to flow over, Peter, sorry, into HVIP changes, but I think the challenge with taking Class B2 trucks, Class 2B trucks out of HVIP and then presumably adding them in CVRP is that fleets, instead of being able to get, thousands, I think it's something like $7,500 for each truck in their fleet. If it's a 2B fleet truck, they would now only be able to get one CVRP incentive for $2,500. So I'm wondering if we could bifurcate this and have the CVRP applicable to, people who are, these are non-commercial trucks, and then HVIP include 2B trucks for fleets, because I think this particular segment of electrifying trucks, there are really none on the road today. There are a few announcements, but we're going to need some help accelerating that market within fleets in particular, especially because these fleets often operate in low-income communities. So I guess I'm asking if we can. I think it's fine to increase the weight category for CVRP to include those non-commercial 2B pickup trucks and vans, but in the case of commercial fleets, I still think they need to be eligible for HVIP. So I appreciate that. I also want to say, just kind of in response to Tesla, I do think that before we remove plug-in hybrids, I mean, I understand the concern, but the truth is that for low-income communities or people who just have one car, a plug-in hybrid may just be a more viable option, and maybe they don't have charging infrastructure in their community or something like that. So I'm a little hesitant to remove them at this point without some consideration of, whether or not those vehicles that would impact the low income folks more. So I'd want to think about that a little more before we just remove plug-in hybrids at this still very early stage of the market.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Andy, both of you for your comments. On the plug-in hybrids, one thing to remind you this year, again, for CVRP, at the moment, there is no new funding. So we're still operating off of prior year funds. And so we, I believe that there is an expectation to consumers for how those funds have been programmed. And the changes we're proposing today, we feel are relatively minor. They're not being made in response to budgetary constraints, like many changes have been made to the program in the past. And so I think until we have new funding in the program, our preference would be to hold off on making major changes that would have bigger impacts on consumers at this time. But we will continue to go back and look at how we adjust for plug-in hybrids in the future. And then with regard to bifurcating CVRP and HVIP, Eileen, thanks for the comment. We'll continue to coordinate with the HVIP team and figure out the best way to address that comment. Thanks.
Okay, and the next person, and reminder to state your affiliation, is Christopher Chavez. I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Yes, thank you. This is Chris Chavez with Coalition for Clean Air. A couple just quick points. Moving up for the vehicle incentives, moving up the federal poverty level to 400%. is something that we've supported in the past and still continue to support. We also strongly support switching from the UDDS model to US EPA all-electric ranges, but that gives consumers a fair, more real-world anticipation of what their mileage will be. I do want to agree with some of the comments that Eileen just made about low-income consumers and plug-in hybrids, as well as those that have limited access to charging abilities. That is a big concern, and certainly want to make sure that all Californians do have access to cleaner transportation. I do have a quick question, though, on Clean Cars for All, and actually before I jump to that, I do want to also say that certainly we want to see plug-in hybrids be part of Clean Cars for All. What are conventional hybrids still under the Clean Cars for All program? Are they still eligible for vehicle replacements, or to be the vehicle replacing the participant's vehicle?
Hi, this is Rishpur Shahi, speaking from Clean Cars for All. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So on the comment of conventional hybrids, Clean Cars for All is ran in conjunction with EFMP base program. So conventional hybrids are not supported by the Clean Cars for All program. However, they can be supported by Clean Cars for All. There are requirements of the type of conventional vehicle. It has to be 8 years or newer, and it also has to have a MPG of 35 miles or better.
Okay. Yeah, and I think ideally moving those, certainly moving the Clean Cars for All program towards electrified models would be preferable. But certainly I understand that CARB might be under some limitations on that.
So I just want to delineate, there are kind of two separate programs here, and definitely agree with you on moving CC4A towards cleaner technologies such as BEVs and whatnot, and that's exactly what it is intended to do. It is a GGRF funded program. The EFMP program is supported by a different funding source, so it is slightly different in those regards. We try to keep a lot of the provisions and the support technologies as closely in line with CC4A as possible, but that is one difference that you pointed out.
Okay, thank you. And just one last quick point, certainly support the increased funding amounts for e-bikes as well. So thank you, that wraps up my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrea, did you want to go to the written Q&A for a bit?
Sure, we can move over to the written Q&A. Okay, so a question from the written Q&A from Meredith Alexander. Has the rebate amount for e-bikes under Clean Cars for All been established?
Hi, this is Rishpur Shahi again. Yes, so e-bikes falls under the mobility option, and the funding amount there is up to $7,500. And I will point out that, let's say an e-bike costs less than $7,500, $6,000 for example purposes. The remaining $1,500 can be put towards another mobility option, such as transit passes or things of that nature.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question from the Q&A box. This is from Roman Partida Lopez with the Greenlining Institute. And he asks, can you share more about the HVIP vehicle types that would now be eligible under CVRP? Would the incentive amount for these vehicles be aligned with the CVRP amount?
This is Raquel Leon. Thank you, Roman, for your question. The change we're looking at for CVRP, one of the main things is we know a lot of the larger vehicles coming to the market, such as the trucks and SUVs. Cybertruck, for example, will have a GVWR that's greater than 8,500 pounds, which is currently allowed under CVRP. So we want to make sure that when we're looking at these personal use larger vehicles that we're still able to provide them incentives under CVRP. And then the question about the rebate amount, it would be CVRP aligned with the CVRP rebate amount if they are brought under the program.
Thank you, Raquel. Moving on, another question. This is from Kohad Duong. Some private industries have announced programs to assist in transitions to clean transportations. For example, Uber's $800 million commitment. Are there any plans to coordinate with this kind of specific large private industry support?
I'll take this one, Lisa McCumber. Not at the moment. It's a great question. We work really closely with industry in various ways, with OEMs. We've, last year there were a lot of conversations about how we can do more when it comes to ride-hail services. At the moment, there aren't any specific coordination plans with larger industry support, but we're definitely interested in learning more about what they're doing and in what ways our incentives can help.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, one more question from the Q&A box, and then we'll transition back to raised hands for a bit. So this question is from Barbie Valentine. Could you clarify when the increase in rebates to $7,500 would come into play?
I think that there may have been a miscommunication. So it's we're not proposing to increase rebate dollar amounts to $7,500. The conversation was around gross vehicle weight. Raquel?
Yeah, I think this is in reference to the Clean Cars for All. There was a discussion of increasing, I believe, for mobility options. Hershey, if you want to discuss that, when that will be live.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. Raquel, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was the increase in rebates. It says the $7,500 would come into play. I believe this is in regards to the mobility option under Clean Cars for All.
Oh, yes. Thank you, and I appreciate that question. So Senate Bill 400 did create this wonderful opportunity to have e-bikes. After the board adopted it into our regulation, Bay Area actually has taken a leadership role and has included this into their implementation plan. We are currently reviewing the implementation plan, which essentially is the nuts and bolts of how that particular option would work. Other air districts will then learn from their experience and move forward. So I would say in Bay Area it will be very near term, and other air districts to follow shortly after that.
Thank you. How about we go to some raised hands for now? Lisa Williams or Eric Brown, would you be able to help?
Yep, I got this. This is Lisa. Okay, so reminder to state your affiliation. Melanie Lewis, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute yourself and begin speaking. Melanie, did you want to ask a question or have a comment?
Hi there. I'm so sorry. I started to talk with it still on mute. I'm with ZEV. We are a zero emissions vehicle company out of New York City. And my question is with the GVWR weight restrictions increasing to 10,000, does this still preclude food trucks then that fall into the class 4 to 7 weight restrictions or no?
Hey, this is Peter Christensen. Food trucks are eligible for HVIP. That's the class 4 through 6 are certainly part of the existing HVIP eligibility criteria. So they would continue to be eligible for HVIP funding.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter.
Okay, and there's one more. We've heard from him before, so we'll see if he has another question. Christopher Chavez, I have enabled your mic and you can unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Oh, my apologies. I did not mean to raise my hand, so.
Okay, thanks. The next one, Chris Nevers, I have unmuted your mic, so you can unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Chris Nevers, and I work for Rivian Automotive. And I would just ask that you please consider revisiting for those vehicles that you're now thinking of including in the CVRP program that generally have more capability than some of their more light duty cousins, if you will. They generally do cost more, and to the extent the MSRP cap exists now, in some cases that MSRP cap is lower than the average cost of a pickup truck today. So I would ask that you at least look at maybe updating that MSRP cap for the more capable vehicles. Thank you.
Okay, and we have no more raised hands.
All right, we have a couple other questions from the question and answer box, so we will go ahead and work through those now. So this first one is from Koha Duong and is a comment. Plug-in hybrids are a useful tool on transitioning low and moderate income communities to cleaner technologies due to the association and security with having the backup of a gas-powered engine. Long-range batteries are still relatively expensive and people are still insecure about the idea of running out of charge with battery-only cars. The availability of a gasoline engine offers security and assurance that would help incentivize them to change without upsetting their daily routine. Thank you for that comment. The next comment is from Rick Theus. Climate fires, folks. We have a serious greenhouse gas problem. Hybrids need to be phased out ASAP. Several incentive programs for charging stations place half of chargers in low-income housing. Minor changes are not good enough. You need to put more money into support for low-income EV buyers. And thank you for your comments. So we are a little ahead of schedule. So I think we can go back to address a few of the comments and questions that were remaining from our earlier session. So our first comment is from Urvi Nagrani, self-affiliated California residents. And she appreciates that all these programs are stretched and the need is greater than the available dollars, and that staff will be unable to meet all needs with the current funding. Is CARB quantifying the investment need of various programs or the market in general so that the data could be used either by the legislature or private investors to estimate where the market is today and make broader future plans? Given the governor's recent announcements on ZEVs in all sectors, knowing the full need as assessed by staff could be very helpful.
Andrea, I think, to comment on that, thank you for that comment. You know, we do, as part of our funding plan every year, we do provide various components that I think speak to your request. We have appendices in the plan that do kind of the technical analysis of the air quality benefits and the more qualitative benefits that we receive from funding these projects, as well as the market assessment that we do for light duty vehicles and one for heavy duty vehicles. So the funding plan will contain all of that, as it does each year. We do have last year's that is out, although again, as we know, this year has kind of rocked every market in a way that none of us have expected. And so I think while there is still useful, viable, and helpful information in prior years' plans on future planning, you know, I think until we are back to a level of normalcy in the markets and just in daily life, it is still very challenging, I think, for us to create a new picture of what things should look like for longer term planning. So for now, we're really looking at what we can do with the money that we have, how that can stretch. And then we're looking at what those outer goals are and how we kind of come back from those goals in the future. So hopefully that helps. We have information on our website, and we'll continue to include information in this year's plan as well.
Lisa, I would just add to that. I think that's a great summary. And, clearly the investment strategy in the appendix to the funding plan is a good picture of, how we assess the needs for incentives over a span of a few years. But the other part of that too, that I think is important to remember, especially when we're looking at the heavy duty transformation to zero emission technologies, is that it's not all going to be supported by incentives. There's clearly a need and a role for regulatory activity in this space. And obviously there's been a lot of activity recently with the advanced clean trucks and innovative clean transit, and looking to the future for heavy duty fleet rules as well. So just a kind of a reminder that incentives are clearly important, absolutely essential to developing the technologies and getting the market ready. But there is a recognition that it's both incentives and regulatory activities that we need to ultimately achieve our goals.
Thank you, Lisa and Peter. We have two more questions from earlier today. So I'll go ahead with those. The first is from Terry Manus, who is from Orange EV, maker of zero emission 100% electric terminal tractors. He's asking, do we know when decisions will be made about core funding? It would be helpful for fleets to know when those funds might become available again so that they can plan for their fiscal cycles appropriately.
So this is David Chen again, and I think Lisa kind of responded, her response to a previous question also applies here. And I think, we just really don't know how we're going to be recommending the allocations until we see the actual GGRF budget. So yeah, and I think our sense is that will happen early next year. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And our next question is from Koha Duong. With the legislature working to determine the state's funding plan during this difficult year and years to come, where do you see these programs on the legislature's list of priorities?
Great question. A crystal ball I wish we had. We don't know yet. Unfortunately, the year closed, I think, before there was a robust conversation on GGRF. So we're excited to see what the fall break and winter restart of the legislative session brings.
All right, so that is all the questions we have from the question and answer box. We do have about 9 minutes before we're supposed to go to a break. So I'll open it up again to anyone. If there are any broader questions about the material we've covered this morning, we can certainly address a few of those here.
Andrea, while we wait for people to queue up, would it be possible for Eric Patton to address the previous question that Matt Schrapp had asked related to the truck loan program?
Sure. Eric, to refresh your memory, the question was regarding what the anticipation was in terms of funding for truck loans and why we're not funding this year, as well as what sort of restrictions were in place for requiring operation of vehicles in state.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, Matt had voiced a concern about us not funding the loan program this year. But yeah, as was indicated in the presentation, that the program has lots of funding right now. We put $48 million in last year, and which is much higher than the typical funding for the program had been, usually like 20 to 25 million in past years. And that was in preparation of SB1. And we were, because now the DMV is doing automatic enforcement, so we're expecting we're preparing for in case there would be a big uptick in activity for the loan program, because non-compliant, if people couldn't register, DMV isn't allowing people to register their trucks if they're non-compliant. So, and the loan program being one of the few options to become compliant. So we haven't seen a big, huge uptick in activity yet because of the SB1, the DMV automatic enforcement. And there's plenty of funding available now in the loan program. And there's been actually this year, because of the downturn in the economy, the loan program activity has actually gone down. So we have lots of funding available, and we'll have plenty for the upcoming year. So that's if there's anything other questions about it, though, let us know. We can address them.
Thank you, Eric. So it does not appear that we have any additional questions, so let's go ahead and move on to take a quick break. We'll meet back here and continue with the presentation at 10:45, when we'll be hearing about the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy, and then get into a discussion of HVIP in greater detail. So we'll see you back in a bit. Thank you very much.
I'm Jason Crow, and I'm here now to discuss this year's updates to the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. In fiscal year 2017-18, CARB developed the initial 3-year investment strategy for heavy-duty vehicles and off-road equipment from low-carbon transportation, now referred to as the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. This document is intended to help guide CARB's low-carbon transportation investments by assessing the advanced technology marketplace, determining what actions and investments are needed to commercialize and deploy the technologies for meeting the state's long-term goals. The strategy functions as a roadmap that is built on focus areas, or beachheads, where investments have the potential to expand and create the greatest impacts. This document serves as an important reference for CARB, as well as other agencies and organizations working to transform the heavy-duty sector. Each year, the strategy includes updates of several key areas. The first of these is a series of status reports or snapshots that describe the current state of advanced technology, heavy-duty vehicles and equipment. These are updated each year with the latest information to reflect the state of the technology. This information also helps to inform our table of 3-year funding priorities, which is updated to include a new 3rd year for fiscal year 2023-24 and reflects the estimated funding levels needed to keep technology moving forward. This year's update also includes a report on the state's school bus population and funding needs. In addition to the annual updates to key assumptions and recommendations, there are a few new additions to this year's strategy document. The first plan noted that there were potentially more ways to highlight or capture the successes of our projects and sought to better understand what all the different elements are that make a successful project. This year, we sought to better describe and communicate how low-carbon transportation investments create healthy communities, grow the green economy, and support technology evolution. This year, we worked with our stakeholders to start to identify quantitative measurements we could use, and we now have a set of metrics that show data from the past few years. Recognizing that many barriers slow or inhibit the proliferation of advanced technologies, we made an effort this year to address one of the chief barriers, which is infrastructure. We took a look at some previously funded projects in order to glean lessons learned about infrastructure needs. And finally, we again worked with stakeholders to help further develop and refine a set of market readiness indicators. These can serve as a way to complete the picture of technology status and assess market readiness by quantifying the market viability of a given technology platform. The strategy has been built on input from stakeholders from many hours of discussion in one-on-one meetings and over the course of 4 public work group meetings to help develop some of the key outcomes. Some key outcomes from this year's effort include market readiness indicators. These indicators include important assessment criteria. Staff worked with stakeholders to develop several criteria in each of 4 indicator categories, referencing them to ensure they didn't overlap with other indicators, and considered possible ways to measure them. Metrics of success. Stakeholders provided direction on potential metrics to consider, while staff responded with a more refined list of metrics that could be quantified using data that is already available. This has now been captured in several easy-to-read infographics. This effort will continue to evolve and expand as additional data becomes available. Technology status snapshots. This year's update included the addition of median points, the location of last year's status compared to this year's status, and readiness range bars that show how far the technology ranges across the commercialization pathway for a given technology. Infrastructure assessment. 2 early projects were identified as potential case studies and were mined for additional information and early lessons learned to help identify potential barriers, as well as best practices for the installation of infrastructure. New industry examples. Several case studies or industry examples have been included in this year's strategy to showcase some of the best examples of progress made in advancing technology in a number of heavy-duty applications. And State School Bus Incentives Report. Pursuant to SB 1403, CARB is including a report on the state school bus fleet. This report is included each year now as an additional appendix to the funding plan. One final key element of the heavy-duty investment strategy is the 3-year investments priorities table, which defines yearly focus areas and proposes funding levels that align with progress needed for each technology pathway. Note that these do not represent all of the project types CARB might fund, but a small subset and aggregation of top priorities that we believe will be most important for continuing to develop and commercialize technologies. The draft funding amounts listed here represent a critical down payment towards meeting the funding need outlined at the beginning of this section, but are not intended to meet the entire need. And now I'd be happy to take any questions or comments on the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. And as a reminder, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the webinar feature to raise your hand. If you're participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand. Staff will announce the name of the commenter and then unmute your line to allow you to make your comment or ask your questions. And please also be sure to introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation.
Okay, our first question is going to come from Jamie. Jamie, your microphone is unmuted.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jason. Just a question on the budgets that roll up for each of the years. Does that budget include infrastructure? Because as you know, you're soon going to be coming out with the first time CARB and CEC have collaborated together on the drayage project, which we're all very excited about, anticipating its release. But does this 646 to 890 include infrastructure? And related to that, what's the plan coordination with CEC on this plan?
So thanks for that question, Jamie. For the demonstration and pilot projects, those amounts do include funding for infrastructure. But then under the commercial category, that does not include infrastructure funding generally. Typically, that's where we would make sure that we're working with other agencies like the Energy Commission to try to coordinate funding for infrastructure that would complement our funding for commercial projects.
Yeah, I think, you know, even at the commercial stage, still the big challenge is the infrastructure funding. And what I find interesting as well with CEC, who just modified the transit infrastructure GFO that's now out on the street, which I think is interesting, is providing more flexibility on where the funds go and who would be station owners, operators, to give a sort of full suite of options by which to provide the fuel supply to the fleet operators. Because this is a big, typically, whether it's trucks or transit vehicles, the fleet operators are not in the business of fuel supply. So recognizing that business relationship and how it would fit, whether it's pilots or in the commercial stage, is going to be very important to the success of rolling this plan out or this strategy.
Thanks,
Thank
Jenny.
you.
I wanted to point out that we do work closely with the CEC on developing this. The reason why we don't include infrastructure currently in the commercial bin was we had included it in previous years. We're working really hard to stretch those vehicle dollars as much as we possibly can in those commercial bins. And with SB 350 and CEC coming to the table with infrastructure dollars, we felt like we could work with them in ways to stretch the vehicle dollars further. But certainly willing to talk more about that as we make our actual decisions with the funding we have available. And we can continue, our relationships with the CEC and partnerships are getting stronger every year. I mean, we've been seeing a lot of opportunity come up with respect to their support on infrastructure funding. We now have a joint solicitation that we'll be releasing in the very near future. So I think that you're seeing the relationships building because of conversations and comments like you're making right now.
Yeah. And by the way, I forgot to introduce my affiliation, Center for Transportation and the Environment. Just one comment response to that, Michelle, and that is, look, we support and realize we're going to need, in the zero emission transition, we're going to need both battery and fuel cell electric. And you mentioned or referenced SB 350, which gives a very good advantage to the battery electric applications. Hydrogen does not yet have that additional benefit. And we're going to need both of these technologies, and we fully believe we'll reach price parity with both technologies, but hydrogen still needs that added support on the funding side, like an SB 350, which I know you don't control that piece of it, but I think it's important to recognize that hydrogen has to play a role in all of this, and it needs additional funding support. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.
Okay, our next question is going to come from Ryan Kelly. Ryan, your microphone is unmuted. Please remember to state your affiliation.
Hello, Jason and Michelle. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. And I just had a couple quick questions. And again, this is Ryan Kenny with Clean Energy. I was just wondering, I saw the disclaimer about the funding at the bottom of the last slide. I wondered if you could expand upon where the additional funds would come, because obviously right now it's beyond the scope of the current funding plans over the last couple of years. And I was also wondering, I know this is not encompassing everything, as the disclaimer also mentions, but I was just wondering about what ifs. And we obviously have advanced clean trucks regulation, which tops off at 40% right now for manufacturers' requirements of zero emission heavy duty vehicles by 2035, leaving 60% of the market open for other vehicles. And we also have the governor's executive order, which said we're feasible under heavy duty trucks. So I was just wondering about what ifs, and if there's any planning on, the inclusion of low NOx trucks at some point within this plan. And those are just my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, this is intended to show what we see as the need for low carbon transportation and AQIP funding and where that funding would go. It's certainly not intended to be the full unconstrained need. We know there are a lot of other funding sources, both within CARB's own incentive portfolio, as well as from other state programs, from federal programs, and even locally funded programs. So there are a lot of other opportunities, and this is not intended to fund everything, just kind of a subset, as we mentioned.
And then to your second question about low NOx within this long-term strategy or within the low carbon transportation AQIP program, I think that again, what's represented on this table are the priority and focus areas where we would want to be moving dollars in, and we're making this estimate under the vision. It's not constrained by previous budget allocations. But as we get our annual appropriations, we'll go through the funding plan process every year, and so you are an active participant in those conversations, and so that is where we would have the discussion about the specifics that are funded throughout the demo, pilot, and commercial bins.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is going to come from Tim. Tim, your microphone is unmuted. Please remember to state your affiliation.
Sometimes we have a problem with Tim being unmuted. He gets disconnected accidentally. So
Tim, why don't you go ahead and type your question into the question answer period. I'm going to go ahead and mute you. We don't have any other question at this time, so we can switch over to the answering some of the questions in the question and answer section.
Sure. The first question came from Mark Abramowitz. I apologize. I'm going to be terrible at pronouncing names. But your comment was CARB submitted a SIP for South Coast to EPA that provides for $1 billion annually in incentives as an attainment strategy. Has CARB staff considered allocating most of the funds to South Coast projects in order to meet SIP requirements? I think my first inclination, and then hopefully Peter, you can step in also and support the responses, is that we are just one part of an overall portfolio. And so this portion of the funding, we're focusing, this is a statewide pot of money, and we're focusing on advancing technologies. And so we will not be taking a portion of this and allocating it specifically to South Coast for projects in order to meet the SIP requirements. However, businesses in the South Coast do have equal access to all of the funding that is available to help move us towards zero emission while also meeting the SIP requirements. But I do want to again stress that we are just one part of an overall portfolio here at ARB, as well as support that comes from local funding and federal funding. Peter, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, the only thing that I would add to that, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but a significant portion of the funding that we provide through HVIP, as well as I think the demos and pilots, actually goes to projects that are located in the South Coast. So we're going to see significant emission reductions in South Coast from those investments, including, I think one of the things we might talk about is the disadvantaged community benefits. I think about more than half of the HVIP investments are providing benefits in disadvantaged communities, diesel emission reductions in disadvantaged communities. So more on that later on this afternoon, but I think you covered it quite well, Michelle.
The next question comes from Urvi Nagrani. Given that you said that this is not the full need, do you have that need documented elsewhere? So as Lisa McCumber eloquently pointed out at the beginning, we do have projections, as we're showing you here, for heavy duty and light duty in our appendices, as well as the emission calculations. Another effort, though, that is underway at ARB is the development of the mobile source strategy. It is a look at the mobile sources in the state and coming and basically developing a strategy on how we could meet our near-term and long-term goals. And so I would urge you, if you're not currently a participant in those work groups, that we could send you the contact information so that you could also be a part of those. I will say that there is a connection and partnership between the work that you're seeing here right now and the work that's going into the mobile source strategy. We are certainly not the only group feeding information to that mobile source strategy, but we are active in the conversation. So Urvi, if you have follow-up questions or if you need to get the information for how to sign up for the mobile source strategy mailing list, please just shoot me an email and let me know. The next question, and I'm going to actually defer, Jason, if you can maybe answer this one. How much infrastructure funding does CEC bring to the table?
Okay, that is a great question. We do coordinate with the Energy Commission as we develop this plan as part of each year's funding plan process. And while we are going through this process for low carbon transportation and AQIP, they are going through sort of a parallel effort with their clean transportation funding plan that they develop with the money through the money that comes through AB 118. And I do not have the exact amount that they bring to the table off the top of my head.
I believe that AB 118, within their AB 118 program, which is the program I'm most familiar with, that's a $100 million portion of funding allocated, continuous appropriation each year. I do know that a portion of that is, it's split between light duty and heavy duty investments. And for more information on how they spend that portion of money, you can tap into they have the similar public process to develop their plans. Tim, I think you have your hand raised again, and you did type into the question box to give you a few more seconds to respond. So maybe we can unmute Tim and go ahead and let him ask his question, and I will be more patient.
There we go. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone right now, Tim, and give you a brief moment to reconnect. You there, Tim? Tim?
Hi, am I coming through?
You are.
Oh, wonderful. Apologies to everyone for the hang up. I swear I'm going to invest in a new laptop. I don't know why that's happening. Thank you once again for everyone at the ARB for continuing this dialogue. I've been recently talking to others about other agencies and just talking about how great CARB is and how inclusive it is in decision making. So thank you again for that. I just want to make sure you guys know that. It's appreciated. Two things. One, something that I've talked about before, asking to be cautious in putting the budget allocations too heavily on the commercial side. We are still in single-digit percentages of penetration, and a lot of what we need to suss out is how zero emission vehicles act at scale, particularly with infrastructure concerns. So, please be mindful in keeping pilots and demos funded, and I would advocate for regional approaches and things like ZANZEF and the drayage projects that really assess this kind of impact. And speaking to infrastructure and SB 350, and Jamie had brought this up, and Michelle as well, Ballard recently stuck its neck out policy-wise to support a bill from Senator Archuleta, SB 662, to get hydrogen as part of transportation electrification. It made it through the Senate, it made it to the Assembly, and unfortunately it was shot down in committee by interests that wanted to keep carbon in. Which is most unfortunate. But I would point out that in the SB 498 report, the CARB did advocate for including SB 350 to include hydrogen as part of that. And it should be for where it's more cost effective for ratepayers. And I would ask the ARB that whatever channels you have, whatever opportunities you have to advocate for this, it would be hugely impactful to let the governor know, to let the legislature know that on the infrastructure side, we are heavily imbalanced, and this is going to become very problematic as we start to go to scale. So I'm not sure who to direct within ARB this comment to, but anything you folks can do to help to make that need louder would be much appreciated. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tim.
Should we continue with some of the hands raised?
Sure.
Okay, our next comment is going to come from Todd. Todd, your microphone has been unmuted. Please remember to state your affiliation. Are you there, Todd? You just muted yourself again. should be able to speak right now. I see the microphone icon. Okay, looks like Todd's having issues with his microphone because it's muting and unmuting. Todd, I'm going to go ahead and disable.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
How about now?
Got you now.
You can?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, it's funny because like now I can hear, I can't hear you guys, but you can hear me. You gotta love COVID. Anyway, hey, I just wanted to chime in, and I apologize for coming in a little late today. I had to quarantine a couple people in my family today because they got possibly exposed to COVID, and that always is fun because then you have to figure out how to set up Zoom with your parents who are not as technically savvy as me, and apparently I'm not even technically savvy enough to hear you and speak at the same time. So I apologize, but I wanted to just emphasize a couple things. Number one, I'm very worried about these number projections. I'm not sure how, on page 23, how you get to these numbers, and I'd be very interested in understanding how we get there. From a number of angles. Number one, we want to help you, of course, get to goal. We want to make sure that we have enough funding to meet our both air quality and greenhouse gas emission goals. Number two, I'm just really doubtful, given the fact that COVID has had such an impact. Wildfires have had such an impact, and I just see a lot of needs out there competing with us, and so it's just something to think about. In addition to that, if we do find ourselves in a less than optimal position in terms of funding, we do have real goals. We have not just goals but standards that we need to meet, such as the Federal Clean Air Act. And I continue to be puzzled as to, how are we accelerating both near and midterm, objectives with a proposal that would ultimately phase out low NOx, especially when we don't have the low NOx engines fully commercialized across all internal combustion engine categories. Diesel, natural gas, propane, whatever fuel you're using, there still remains only one sector that was able to deliver early, thankfully, but is nowhere near, I think, where you think we are in terms of health and the ability to move forward. I would also argue that yes, there are other programs that the Air Resources Board provides, but they're horrible. They don't work for us, and they don't work for most folks. In fact, they mostly don't work for electric either. And we were promised last year, in good faith, to try to figure out how we can fix Carl Moyer and other programs. But unfortunately, there has not been a ton of progress. And I would just further argue that if you need to crush a fleet or crush a truck to qualify for a program, you're probably very unlikely to be a strong candidate for a advanced clean truck, regardless of how you define it. So I constantly, have to remind you guys when you say, well, there's other funding programs out there that could really help the need. No, there really isn't. Until those programs are fixed, I would stop saying that, because this program is the program that works. This is a program that we desperately need down at the ports for support for low NOx trucks. We desperately need it for a potential warehouse rule that the South Coast is going to try to implement. And quite honestly, we need the market signals. If you don't provide the market signals, and people just decide, what, I can't make numbers, I can't, I'm not willing to get to do something better than just base diesel, because I'm not getting the market signals from ARB, and the regionals may not have the authority or enough authority to require to do something better than a baseline diesel, I'm telling you what's going to happen, guys. It's going to be, I'm going to purchase just a compliant diesel, get by, wait, and you better pray that your projections in terms of technology feasibility come through, because if they fall through, we're all in trouble. We're all in trouble in terms of meeting our goals, not just air quality goals, but greenhouse gas goals. So I think we can walk and chew gum. I've told you guys this many, many times. You know, I love your team. You know, you're all very good people, and I really like working with you. But I sometimes feel like, you know, I don't get listened to enough, and we want to work with you in the legislature. We want to work with you in so many venues to get to goal, but you know, you need to be a little bit broader and a little bit more inclusive with your plans. So those are my comments, and thank God I figured out this mic thing. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Well, Todd, in the off chance that your speakers decide to work once you've turned your microphone off, I just wanted to thank you for your comments. Your message has been received, and we, you know, again, our plan is without constraints, without a monetary constraint, and it is true that what you're seeing here is a focus on zero emission, and you know, again, we still make our decisions annually on what ends up into each funding plan based on the actual dollar amounts that are allocated to us. As far as how we've determined these projections, we did cover that in our in the work groups. But just as a quick highlight, all of these projections are based on historical data that have come in for the programs. So for example, past HPIP data has been used to make the HPIP projections. The same thing with the limited amount of historical information we have from CORE. In places where we don't have a lot of historical information, it's backed up by data that has been provided through applications received through our demo and pilot solicitations and through conversations with OEMs and about their production and costs. And so we can have a more detailed conversation about that offline. And again, we did cover a lot of that information in our work group process.
Okay, so our next question is going to come from Bill. Bill, I'm going to unmute your microphone, and then we'll switch back over to the typed in questions. Please remember to state your affiliation, Bill.
Yes, good morning. Okay, my name is Bill Zobel. I'm the Executive Director of the California Hydrogen Business Council. Jason, good morning. Michelle, good morning. Thanks for the overview today. I find these workshops very helpful ahead of the rulemaking to, you know, convey information, what you guys are thinking, the direction that you're headed. The transparency there is really great. So we wanted to thank you for that and the opportunity to continue to work with you on these things. I'll make a couple of brief comments. You know, we support Jamie Levin of the Center for Transportation and the Environment's comments that he made earlier. I don't want to reiterate those on infrastructure, but that's extremely important that we coupled infrastructure with this. I know you guys understand that. So his comments, again, just want to point those out. We're also very supportive of the comments Tim Sassine made from Ballard about, you know, the need for funding in the pre-commercial stage of the market. We've got several folks that are engaged in that, and more coming in all the time. The interest, you know, in our space has really grown dramatically, I would say, over the last several months in particular. The governor's executive order took that to a whole new level. So we're looking for, you know, a much larger uptake in the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle segment and fuel cell electric truck segment. So hopefully some things that come out of this will help to support that market. With regard to infrastructure, I know you guys were looking at potentially developing some metrics on the disbursement of funds to give you some guidelines and some data to see, you know, where should we be putting these things? Where should we be putting our resources? What's been successful? What hasn't? I think that's a great idea. Metrics drive business, and if metrics help drive, you know, government resource, direction of government resources, I think that's good as well. We'd be particularly interested, I think, in an infrastructure metric that shows something relative to the cost of installed infrastructure, its usage and convenience. I don't have an answer for what that metric needs to look like yet, but we'd love to work with you guys on that. to compare the various types of zero emission infrastructure, and what kind of metric can be used to assess its, its effectiveness in the field relative to cost. So I think that would be something that would be very helpful. We'd love to work with you on that. One last thing I'll touch on is there was a lot of talk in the previous session about low-income communities and ensuring that they have access to zero-emission vehicles and zero-emission transportation, which we absolutely support. Eileen touched on the fact that many folks have limited access to electric vehicle charging infrastructure in those communities. That's largely driven by the fact that many of those people do not live in single-family homes. They live in multi-unit dwellings. They park on the street. So the provision for them of having a centralized refueling infrastructure that can be made available through hydrogen at your local refueling center today would be very convenient and very cost-effective for them. So we would just like to point that out. And lastly, there was another speaker, I can't remember who it was, pointed out that many of these low-income families have only one car. And so the convenience associated with that vehicle is exceptionally important for that group. Their ability to fuel quickly, their ability to get extended range, go to multiple locations in a single day, even have multiple family members use the car continuously throughout the day, working different shifts or whatever it might be. So that really bodes well, I think, for hydrogen fuel cell technology in that part of the market. So again, I appreciate your transparency. I appreciate you guys putting on these workshops, and we very much look forward to working with you on your plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
So I'm going to go back to the typed in Q&As, and Peter, this one I think would be one for you to address. But Robert Naylor asked, can Daimler Chrysler settlement money be directed to the heavy duty vehicle program, particularly ZE Transit?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so that's a great question on Daimler. The timing on that is not quite ready yet for working on exactly how those funds would be used to mitigate the NOx emissions from those vehicles. Unlike VW, which the consent decree is already in place and California's plan for those investments is already underway, the consent decree still has a few months to go, is my understanding, before that consent decree is approved by the courts. So there's still a little bit of ways to go, but it is another opportunity for achieving NOx reductions. And once the consent decree is approved by the court, then we'll be able to move into the implementation phase for those mitigation funds.
Beverly Deschaux asked or commented, is CARB aware that fuel for hydrogen vehicles requires twice the fossil fuel as driving that vehicle on straight fossil fuel, and therefore represents the opposite of GHG emissions? We in EV tech community believe that hydrogen is the fossil fuels industry way of keeping in the game. Thank you, Beverly, for your comment, and we can continue to discuss that in the future. Does anybody have anything they would like to respond to Beverly? I think I will add that one of the possibilities, I think that when you're thinking about the types of fuels that go into electric vehicles, both hydrogen and electricity have ways to be produced from renewable resources. And I think that that is one of the considerations that we take into consideration when we're making our decisions about electric vehicles and the incentives and regulations that guide their deployment. Naveen Berry from South Coast asked, as I have previously testified, is there a demo and pilot pathway available for cleaner than Tier 4 locomotives, but not quite yet ready for zero emission? Would ZE idle, the locomotive would include a battery pack qualify under ZE rail? The demo and pilot pathways tend to include, there have been some cases where we've had cleaner combustion or hybrid technologies. And I believe if we would go back and look at the table, there had been some clarifications added to construction ag, and I believe some logos that were zero or near zero, and by near zero we mean hybrid. I think actually it doesn't say near zero, it says zero and hybrid technologies. And so I don't believe that we're not excluding them from having the opportunity. They just might not be listed and identified as a priority on the funding table. But we do recognize their importance. The next question is from Stephanie Lee. With the final funding budget, which is likely not going to match the annual fiscal year amounts, be allocated to the same % proportion to the demos, pilots, and commercial categories? My comment would be to allocate most of the funding to the commercial category given the sunset of AQIP, the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation, and upcoming Advanced Clean Fleet Regulation. Stephanie, I think to your comment, we would, once we have an allocation, we would come back to our work groups and have this type of discussion. So I think thank you for stating your preference and your thoughts on how we would invest, and I encourage you to be a part of the conversation when and if we get an appropriation in any given fiscal year. And Jason, I'm going to continue to read the questions, but if you could take the first stab at answering, that would be great. Todd Campbell typed in, do we want fossil fuel industries in the game? If they are not working toward climate change goals. What kind of thinking is that? I actually don't know that that has an answer. Todd, thank you for your comment. And Beverly Deshow also commented that she saw a critical phrase missing in her question, that driving hydrogen is like driving a fossil fuel vehicle 2 times with the fuel required to produce the hydrogen fuel. Does CARB understand this, and therefore does CARB see that it is not prudent to fund hydrogen vehicles and hydrogen infrastructure? Again, Beverly, I think we have several zero emission pathways that CARB is supporting, and hydrogen, while currently may be produced primarily through fossil fuel type activities, there are also ways to produce it with renewable. And so we want to make sure that, and they both have battery electric and fuel cells, both have different capabilities right now. And we want to make sure that we're keeping the opportunities present or open for everyone. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add? Sue Dexter commented, what I understand about hydrogen fuel production, there are drastic disparities between different production processes. Some are quite good while others poor. So it depends on the type of process used. There are very good academic articles on this subject. Thank you, Sue, for providing that feedback and comment. And if you were able to forward some of those academic articles, I believe we probably have access to them, but it would be great if you wanted to share the resources with us. Thanks. There are a lot of comments and questions in the Q&A box related to hydrogen production. And so while I think they are great comments, I don't necessarily have a response to them. So I'm just going to go ahead and answer them live so that the audience can see the questions and comments. But I'm not necessarily going to respond to them. So Antonio, your comments, I think everybody would be able to see now. Mark, your comment as well. And Beverly, your comments are also now so that everybody can see, as well as Michael McDonald.
Hands raised. Should we go back to some hands?
Yes, please.
Okay, our next question is going to come from Stephen. Stephen, your microphone is unmuted. Please don't forget to state your affiliation. Also, when you're typing in the question and answer, please include your affiliation in there as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, yeah, I'm Stephen Ellis with American Honda Motor Company. And, you know, I just want to address the comment that was just made because I think you at ARB have a duty and obligation to cut through information that's provided to you that is just, you know, factually flawed for a person, I believe named Beverly, to say that hydrogen requires twice the fossil fuel as driving the vehicle on straight fuels use is just a blatant lie. It's not only misinformation, but it's fostering information that I would hope that you basically just negate as a comment. Clearly, ARB knows that the hydrogen required for vehicle transportation is already at a 33% minimum. The hydrogen supplied in the market today is already at over 50% renewable. And at the 33% level, the carbon emission reductions from hydrogen fuel cell vehicles is nominally 50 to 60% compared to internal combustion vehicles. For someone to foster such false and misleading information does no justice to the goals of ARB and industry to cut carbon emissions. You know, people must be carbon emission reduction deniers to foster such ill-informed information in public testimony. Certainly, ARB, you have access to the Department of Energy GREET model. You have your own California GREET model. Industry knows the real and measurable emission reductions from hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And I would just ask that you strike those kind of comments from the testimony. You're smarter than that. A comment saying there's drastic differences in hydrogen production is no different than there's vast, drastic differences in electricity production. And that's why ARB and industry agreed to a ever improving percentage of renewable hydrogen for transportation, just as the grid continues to get greener, and both are on a pathway to 100% renewable. Hydrogen industry has adopted the Hydrogen Council's goal of decarbonized hydrogen by 2030. So in reality, you may actually end up with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles at 100% renewable use of fuel, hence zero carbon, before light duty battery electric vehicles achieve that goal. But that's not to take a shot at any single technology. Both are necessary and required. Both provide people options, and especially, you know, with light and heavy duty, no single technology is going to achieve these goals. So I just wanted to make sure that this was very clear and understood by you at ARB, and you need to comment in response because you know the data, you know the facts. Thank you very much.
Stephen, absolutely agree. And it's true that I was remiss to mention AB 1505 or SB 1505. It's the bill that requires hydrogen production to have 33% renewable currently and increase over time to higher percentages of renewable. And I also was remiss to go down the pathway of talking about the low carbon fuel standard and how that is driving the carbon intensities or the carbon footprints of these fuels down. And so as over time, as both electricity and hydrogen become renewable, and that was also a very good point that not all electricity is renewable electricity, and some of it does have a higher carbon footprint that's offset by the efficiencies of the vehicles. That as we get closer to renewables, 100% renewables in both of those sectors, we're going to be seeing increased GHG reductions, not just from the vehicle efficiency perspective, but also the fuel going into those vehicles. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is you've asked for comments to be stricken from the testimony to be stricken from the record. This is not a formal board hearing. This is really a workshop so that we can gather ideas and share our thoughts with a larger group of stakeholders. So those will be part of the recording, and those answers, those comments are in the Zoom tool where the Q&As are all hosted. But know that, you know, this is an opportunity for people to be able to come and speak their ideas so that we can address them. So thank you for weighing in. And I know that we're going to be getting a lot of input based on the hydrogen conversation into the Q&As right now. Just know that we are monitoring them. We do have, you know, we have been supportive of hydrogen. We will continue to be supportive of hydrogen, as well as electricity and battery electric vehicles and the hydrogen refueling infrastructure where we can. So with that, Jason, I think we're gonna, or Andrea, I think we're gonna move on.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions and comments. And I believe now it's time to turn this over to Matt Williams, who's going to talk about clean truck and bus vouchers. Matt?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jason. Great job with the presentation on the changes to the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy. Really enjoyed that and the comments and questions that followed. I'm really glad that I'm coming after you, actually, because I think the next part of this presentation really helps to tie in the importance of the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy in so much of what we do, from how we utilize our investments to further our goals, to how we track our progress with, you know, the technology status updates and the new market readiness indicators. And of course, important among all of that is how we prioritize our investments, because of course, resources are not limited. In fact, quite the contrary. And I think that will be the dark segue to my section of the presentation on clean truck and bus vouchers, better known as HVIP, where it is not all doom and gloom. Next slide, please. So HVIP satisfies the next step in the low carbon transportation strategy for technology commercialization. Following demonstrations and pilots, HVIP builds on successful beachheads, providing first come, first serve funding for early commercial deployments of zero and near zero emission technologies. HVIP assists California's fleets, supports the growing number of clean technology companies calling California home, and provides economic and health benefits across the state. By driving the development of early zero and near zero emission markets, HVIP continues to support the goals set by the governor's landmark executive order last week. Next slide. Changing markets, evolving needs, and limited resources are driving tough decisions on project priorities. Guiding principles direct a program throughout its life, irrespective of changes in its strategies, circumstances, or abilities. The fiscal year 2009-2010 funding plan described original guiding principles for the air quality improvement program. Those were used as a basis for staff's evaluation of updated guiding principles specifically for HVIP. After incorporating stakeholder feedback, staff is considering the following guiding principles. They are designed to not be strictly interpreted, but rather reflect foundational values that would be factored into decision-making. Next slide. HVIP has provided nearly 9,000 vouchers totaling $510 million since its launch in 2009. Project demand is indicative of HVIP's success, bringing more clean technology options to California and garnering interest from the state's fleets. Sustained, elevated project participation exhausted fiscal year 18-19 funds in July 2019, initiating a wait list of voucher requests for future funding. But demand proved so significant that the program closed on November 1st of last year, after 1,600 voucher requests on the wait list surpassed the entire available fiscal year 19-20 budget. The wait list was fully processed, meaning vouchers verified and approved, in April of this year, but the program's unprecedented closure to new voucher requests will continue until funding is approved by the board. Orders made while HVIP is closed will not be eligible for funding when HVIP reopens. Vouchers will only be available for purchases made at that time. Next slide. Let's talk a little more about what we've observed. An astonishing 60% of all vouchers and 80% of all voucher funding requested since 2009 came in the 24 months before the waitlist closed last November. That dramatic growth is visible in the graph to the right, where 7 cumulative years are shown in the front row, while less than 2 years of vouchers in the back row tower above. There's little to suggest that growth won't continue. There are 30 manufacturers and upfitters producing over 130 HVIP eligible trucks and buses. Following the launch of the Clean Off-Road Equipment Project, or CORE, at the beginning of the year, all yard truck vouchers and HVIP not yet redeemed were moved over, solidifying the distinction between the on and off-road incentives. While HVIP is a first-come, first-served program, about half of all vouchers have been requested in disadvantaged communities, helping to meet the state's goals for investments in these communities and helping to provide much-needed diesel particulate matter reductions in disadvantaged communities. More information about HVIP vehicle eligibility and HVIP's accomplishments are available online. And of course, every HVIP-supported purchase is a partnership with fleets, dealers, and manufacturers. HVIP funds catalyze private investment and economic growth, so far leveraging $1.2 billion in additional spending. That's nearly $6 of additional investment for each incentive dollar provided through HVIP. HVIP faces urgent and additive challenges. An already difficult fiscal outlook has been intensified by the state's broader fiscal and economic crises. Staff's baseline projection for fiscal year 2021 funding need is estimated to be at least $270 million. Multiple uncertainties confound the estimate, among them pent-up demand due to the program not accepting new voucher requests since November 2019. Staff propose allocating $25 million from AQIP to help support HVIP demand. We also anticipate additional funding becoming available from canceled HVIP vouchers after first offsetting about $21 million in reduced funding from cap and trade auction proceeds. As a result, HVIP needs creative, effective, and adaptive solutions that reduce the severity of funding shortfall while closely conforming to the program's core missions and minimizing impacts to priority nascent markets. With stakeholder input, staff has developed several preliminary options that would reduce fiscal demand. But let me be clear, it's challenging to imagine any outcome in which HVIP remains funded through to next fiscal year. Following a work group in April, previous slide please. Following a work group in April and many individual stakeholder meetings, staff is considering 5 policy levers that will help to focus limited funds into greater alignment with the guiding principles. Most of these policy levers offer multiple levels of action, and I'll describe that in more detail on the next slide. The first potential change is a reduction in voucher amounts. Last year, the board granted authority to CARB's executive officer to reduce some or all voucher amounts by up to 20%, and staff anticipates continuing this authority. Staff is evaluating reductions for specific vehicle categories based in part on market data or upcoming regulations. Voucher caps have existed in HVIP in different forms. Voucher caps limit the number of vouchers that can be requested by a fleet or manufacturer and can be either a hard cap that does not allow any voucher requests beyond the cap, or a soft cap that reduces voucher amounts or adds restrictions past the set cap. Fleet caps allow more fleets to participate and focuses resources on aiding fleets taking their first steps into the advanced technology market. The current fleet cap is 200 vouchers per year, and staff is considering a reduced cap as low as 20 vouchers per year to focus on overcoming significant barriers with initial fleet deployments. Following stakeholder feedback, staff is considering a rolling manufacturer voucher soft cap to encourage more efficient vehicle delivery while still offering the flexibility needed by advanced technology providers. A rolling cap limits the number of active vouchers requested but not yet redeemed that a manufacturer can have at any time. The soft part would require vouchers requested above the cap to undergo case-by-case review to affirm production and delivery timing for all active vouchers from that manufacturer. AQIP previously had rolling voucher caps, and staff is considering a similar cap up to 200 vouchers. Graduating natural gas engines is again under consideration this year. Last year, staff proposed graduating all natural gas engines from HVIP. The board directed staff to keep the larger 11.9 liter engine, suitable for Class 8 trucks, in the program. The board noted there were few zero-emission options for Class 8 trucks at that time. Now, almost a year later, there are several zero-emission Class 8 options eligible for HVIP funding, including trucks from BYD, Freightliner, Lion, Kenworth, and Peterbilt. More are expected to become HVIP eligible soon. We're also considering a couple eligibility changes, including raising the minimum GVWR to keep HVIP's focus on heavy commercial trucks and simplifying transit and shuttle bus funding by aligning the incentive amounts. Even if we were to implement all of these potential policy levers in their strictest forms, it is unlikely that we would be able to meet all of the demand in HVIP. Next slide. The flexibility to adapt to circumstances is a desirable one. As I said in the previous slide, many of the potential policy levers offer varying degrees of effect, which becomes valuable in adjusting our policy suite to varying fiscal conditions. Here, you see an abstract visual representation of how we can build a policy decision tree, which is a term I very much regret creating because it has obviously no resemblance to a decision tree. But here you see ranges of available funds point to suites of policy levers. The idea is that at higher funding levels, we might need fewer and less restrictive policies, but as available resources drop, the opposite becomes true. With greater resources at the top, we might set high fleet and manufacturer caps. Somewhere in the middle, those caps drop and we might start reducing some voucher amounts. Further down, voucher cuts may be broadened. And by the time we get to the bottom, HVIP might make more dramatic changes to limit vouchers to only select vehicle types. This is obviously a worst case scenario we hope to avoid. To be clear, if I haven't been already, we don't foresee any scenario under which HVIP is able to meet demand. However, all of the policy levers offer cost savings and help HVIP more effectively meet its goals under any fiscal circumstance. You can find more detail on this concept in Table 5 of the discussion document. And now, I'll invite any questions about HVIP. If you have questions or comments on other parts of today's presentation, we'll open it up to all of those topics for the last 30 minutes. Remember to use the raise hand button or the Q&A window on Zoom, and if you've called in, that's #2 to raise your hand.
Okay, this is Lisa Williams. I guess, unless I hear otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and start with the folks with their hands raised. Okay, Andy Schwartz, I have unmuted your line, so you can go ahead and begin speaking, and please state your affiliation.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so this is Andy Schwartz with Tesla. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak this morning. Again, we appreciate CARB's efforts to reform this program and stretch limited funds further, recognizing the demand challenges that HFIP faces. We do have a few thoughts that we'd like to offer, as well as a few questions. First, we do support significantly reducing the incentive levels. Certainty and stability of funding is fundamentally important to making the program effective. High incentives with very little chance of receiving anything will not drive adoption. So, kind of regardless of the budget levels, and given what Matt said about, there's really no scenario where HFIP is going to be able to meet demand, we would encourage considering cuts deeper than 20%, really regardless of the budget amounts that are ultimately seen. We'd also encourage CARB to look at modifying the incentive framework such that the voucher amount is calibrated to some objective factor that can serve as a proxy for GHG impacts that a vehicle can be expected to have. We think this would align the program more effectively with ARB's goals, as well as the goals that are articulated in the recent executive order. We don't think this necessarily would result in complicating the program. It could be done, for example, by scaling the incentive level as a function of the zero emission range, or as a function of the battery size, or for fuel cell vehicles, the equivalent thereof for those vehicle types. On the soft cap for manufacturers, as an alternative or in addition to that, I was curious if ARB has considered tightening the time frame within which a manufacturer has to deliver vehicles, and after which the voucher would be forfeit or its value reduced. We think that would be, again, potentially an alternative to that approach, or maybe in addition to. This would also further the goal of creating strong incentives for manufacturers to timely deliver vehicles and ensure that voucher funds aren't being unduly tied up. If such an approach were taken, we do think an appeals process should be included, as there certainly are factors beyond the control of the manufacturer that should be considered. And then I have a couple of questions. So first, curious if staff is considering a time frame for graduating plug-in hybrid vehicles. As I discussed at some length earlier today on the CVRP, there are a lot of serious concerns regarding the extent to which hybrids actually advance CARB's objectives, especially in comparison to ZEVs when one considers real-world operations and performance. So that's one question. I'm also curious if you can provide a little bit more color around the notion of graduating technologies based on maturity, and what characteristics or criteria result in a technology being deemed mature. I think we don't necessarily agree with the idea that technological maturity alone should determine whether or not a technology remains eligible. Regardless of technology maturity, incentives may still be needed to accelerate adoption and can support early action by manufacturers and fleets, consistent with the ACT and the forthcoming fleet rule. So I'll leave it there. Appreciate any responses you can give. And again, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Andy. I'll actually start at the end and then work my way back because it's very timely. At the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the deep connections between the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy and our actual incentive projects like HFIP, and that's one of the most clear nexuses. So the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy talks about how we assess the readiness of a technology, both for its technical capabilities, but separately for its market readiness. So those are very different things. You talk about, you could have a technology that's very capable and well developed, but has other barriers that prevent widespread market transformation, such as high infrastructure costs or not having an expanded training network for service. So those are the sort of things that we do consider. Graduation is not just about how ready the actual technology, how capable the technology itself is in that application. So you can find more on that in the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy, and definitely feel free to reach out to Jason. As for hybrids, there are currently no hybrids or plug-in hybrids eligible for HFIP funding at this time. Last year, the requirements were changed, requiring at least 35 miles of all-electric range. So at this time, there's no consideration for the graduation of hybrids. The fact that none of those exist is probably an indicator that the technology readiness is low, or that there hasn't been demand for that technology. So until there's an indication that that technology is ready to graduate by some of the metrics I just talked about, we would not be considering that. And then the last thing is just to make sure that everyone understands that we do currently have restrictions on the lifetime of a voucher. And we also have an appeals process, we call that case by case, where we can evaluate the merits of a voucher extension.
Matt, that was a great response to a many-part question. I would just maybe expand a little bit on your points on the plug-in hybrids. And it's certainly true that while they remain eligible for HVIP, that we don't have any manufacturers that have brought any plug-in hybrids with zero emission range to the market at this point. We're not recommending graduating that or eliminating that funding, though, even though there's not an eligible vehicle yet. Given the fact that we're starting to see Class 8 trucks entering the market, and the manufacturers have essentially at this point chosen to go all zero emission, all without having any kind of plug-in hybrid capabilities at this point. But there still could be opportunities, especially as we're looking for technology options for longer range trucks, where there might be an opportunity for a plug-in hybrid technology to help provide some of those extended ranges that we need for longer haul trucking. So I think from that standpoint, we're not recommending eliminating that funding option, but it doesn't have an impact on the current program or on the budget.
Okay, the next person is Stephanie Lee. I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and start speaking.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Hi, everybody. This is Steph Lee here from TransPower Meritor. Thank you so much for sharing the document ahead of time. This is so helpful to gather thoughts. I'd like to really, commend CARB and the staff for really thinking through a very hard situation. And so I just would like to comment on the HVIP portion. So the key goal is fleet expansion and not a scrap and replace program. And the intention has been to drive the medium and heavy duty market. I feel that HVIP has been extremely successful in doing this. A lot of manufacturers behind the scenes do look to HVIP in terms of forecasting volumes and demand from fleets. In terms of limiting these resources, I would say that I support the fleet voucher caps, just wanting to make sure that we have the most amount of fleet participants and that HVIP isn't just monopolized by a few large companies. I might even support lower fleet caps, meaning lower quantities per fleet. And also highly support the 20% voucher reduction and even lower if need be. The amount is still quite generous in terms of what is available today. And a lot of fleets don't, necessarily meet the requirements for scrap and replace. So HVIP remains incredibly important. The soft cap for manufacturers, I will disagree, kind of coming from my standpoint here and the companies that I represent. I would just sort of say that it would be good for the fleet to be able to choose a manufacturer and they're not limited to drive the market a certain way. I think there would be ideas. I think what Andy from Tesla mentioned was, one such way of delivery time. I like that idea. Or also making a voucher more flexible in case the manufacturer cannot deliver on time or something changes where there's other concerns like infrastructure and a fleet could choose a different manufacturer. I know that's a little more complicated because these are tied to dealerships, but just an idea. So the soft caps for manufacturers, I feel that would maybe control the market too much, but that's just my opinion. I would certainly graduate any non-zero emission vehicles and ultimately really prioritize areas or vehicle models where the incremental cost is still very high. So certain models and certain GVWR, the incremental cost may be closing, and so the market forces may be moving in that way, where the total cost of ownership is looking more favorable, especially in the next 2 to 4 years. but there are some, especially in the heaviest duty sectors, that the incremental cost is still quite high. And finally, you know, I'd like to also prioritize the disadvantaged community locations and seeing if there's a way to really focus on that segment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Okay, the next one is Tim Sassine. Tim, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and start speaking. I will give you a little extra time because I know you're dealing with technology issues.
I appreciate that. I think technology is agreeing. Thank you once again for this conversation. Always great to hear Matt and Peter speak. I'd like a few more jokes, Matt. That's one request. A couple of points to pile onto some past speakers on this topic. One, when thinking about award amounts, I like the idea of tying it to the benefits, and particularly for what you use the vehicles for. Finding a way to tie the incentives to either passenger miles traveled per ton of annual GHG avoided, or ton miles per ton of GHG emitted or avoided annually, gets to how much are we really saving for what these vehicles need to accomplish. So to take that into consideration in your calculus. The other point is towards caps, which I would also advocate for as an approach to spreading out HVIP a bit and looking towards market transformation as opposed to market acceleration, and putting in caps for manufacturers and for fleets until you get to the point where you've depleted the funding and you can go back and readdress those that may have tapped out their caps. This would help to get a better assessment of the different varieties of vehicles getting onto the road, help to seed those vehicles, and hopefully help to get some field experience to show where work is needed and what's really doing well. So those are my recommendations. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, next we have Matt Schrapp. Matt, please state your affiliation, and I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Thank you very much. And I realized that I did not identify myself more on my first round of comments. Matt Schrapp with Velocity Vehicle Group and Crossroads Equipment Lease and Finance. Just a couple quick clarifying questions. Matt, thank you very much. Great presentation, very clear. I think we all understand that, you know, demand is outstripping funding. One thing that I would just, if you could clarify, I think I know the answer, but when you say remove natural gas, I'm assuming that that means renewable natural gas. And I'm also wondering then if that is going to limit propane's ability if they were able to come up with a platform that was near zero or below. So just a quick clarification on that. And then I did have a couple other suggestions and questions and would love your perspective on it.
Hey, Matt.
Peter.
Good question. Thanks. Yeah, the recommendation that we're making is to graduate the natural gas combustion engines. I think the intent behind that is to really look at focusing on zero emission technologies. So while we're not addressing propane specifically, I would say that from the staff consideration perspective at this point in time, it is encompassing of any of the existing combustion technologies. What remains on the table for future consideration would be what is the appropriate funding opportunity for engines that meet a future optional low NOx standard. And I'm referring to the 0.01 standard that would be part of the omnibus regulation that's been approved for adoption. That's not something that we're going to address here today or even in this funding plan, but it is something that we would want to discuss in the future about what is the right opportunity for that particular technology.
Okay, so next I think we'll go to the written Q&A.
All right, so the first question in the written Q&A is from Chris Shimoda. Understand the logic of lowered fleet caps or lowered fleet voucher caps, but staff should consider the relationship between vehicle and infrastructure deployment, which is closely linked. In certain utility programs, infrastructure must be fully utilized within near-term timeframes or there are chargebacks. This does not allow fleets to piecemeal vehicle procurements over multiple years. Thank you for that comment, Chris. Next, we have a comment from Naveen Berry. Matt, thanks for the comprehensive presentation on HVIP. I agree with the tremendous growth in requested vouchers. From the presentation, especially in graduating all near zero emission engines and Class 8 trucks, can you discuss how many voucher requests have been received and approved under HVIP for Class 8 trucks, and if any have yet been put into service? With a clarification, how many zero emission Class 8 trucks?
Yeah, most of those are fairly new. It's been a recent development that we've gotten so many manufacturers, including the big and well-known ones, to get certified and come to HVIP for eligibility. So that's relatively new. We don't have voucher requests for most of the Class 8 zero emission trucks, but we do have at least some. Peter?
Yeah, Naveen, we're happy to follow up with you on that. I think Matt hit the most important point there, though, which is that Class 8 zero emission trucks are new to the market, and that's really what we would expect to see when manufacturers are most of the big OEMs are just entering the space now. Of course, we've had zero emission Class 8 manufacturers at smaller volumes for a small amount of time at this point. But we'd be happy to share that data with you. Most of that data is available on the HVIP website, downloadable format, but we can certainly work with you on that. I did want to circle back to Chris's point, and just, we've hit on it a couple of times today about the importance of infrastructure and planning early for infrastructure, because it really is the most important for a fleet that hasn't yet adopted zero emission technologies. It's really important to start addressing infrastructure from the very beginning. As part of recognizing that in HVIP, to the extent that fleets are interested, as soon as they access HVIP and request vouchers in HVIP now, with their concurrence, we're sharing that information with our utility partners, with the Energy Commission, with folks that can help to assist in planning and potentially funding for that infrastructure. So there's a coordinated approach with the vehicle and the infrastructure. We're continuing to build that coordination, and infrastructure information as a kind of a single point of contact or point of information. The HVIP website now has a growing amount of information on infrastructure planning and funding opportunities. So it's a great point. It's one that we're definitely following and doing everything we can to coordinate with our partners, both at the utilities and CEC and other partners as well.
Yeah, and since we circled back to it, I was actually going to follow up with Chris offline, because this is kind of a in the weeds topic. For those who are not familiar, the SB 350 authorized, or the CPUC authorized infrastructure investment programs for the IOUs, and some similar programs with a few POUs do require that vehicles be deployed to start utilizing that infrastructure within set timelines. And at the same time, the utilities are hoping that fleets will make larger moves and plan for their future expansions of their fleets. And so there is something to consider here about how fleet caps interface with that. But luckily, we do have very close relations with the utilities. As Peter said, we do a lot to help the fleets that we work with and make sure that the utilities and the PUC and the CEC understand the actions that we're taking, how we're changing policies, and how that might interface with or impact other programs. So we do think that the recommendations or the options that we just listed would not be deleterious to the goals of those other programs. But I am happy to follow up with you offline. It's a topic of personal interest for me.
Yeah, and just maybe one last point on that before we get to the next question. Part of that planning ahead for infrastructure is not just thinking about what the fleet is intending to purchase right now, but what kinds of purchases are they anticipating for the future. So that does play into infrastructure planning, making sure that the infrastructure is sized right from the beginning, so that it has the capacity to expand, and whether that's a conversation about, are there advantages to battery electric technology? Is this a fleet that, might have an opportunity for deploying fuel cell technologies in a more cost-effective way, looking at the infrastructure demands and things like that. So it's definitely a really important part of deploying that technology.
Thank you, Matt and Peter. All right, so this next question is from Fraser Atkinson, CEO, and Brendan Riley, President of Green Power Motor Company. The HVIP program has clearly helped to drive electrification strategies, with operators purchasing zero-emission medium and heavy-duty equipment. We believe that this program can be one of the foundations for California to achieve its goals of achieving 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2045. We have a number of suggestions to refine the existing program. Number one, reinstate the annual limit of 200 vouchers per single fleet per funding year to maximize the number of fleets with access to limited HVIP incentive funding. The first 100 vouchers would be at full amount for the eligible vehicle, and the second 100 vouchers at 50% of the amount for that eligible vehicle. Requirement for voucher reimbursement requests along with vehicle registration to be filed within 18 months from the time limitation to use vouchers. I think the question may have gotten slightly cut off here. It does continue on though to number two, time limitation to use vouchers. Requirements for the voucher reimbursement requests along with vehicle registration to be filed within 18 months from the date the voucher request is approved. If the original qualified vendor cannot deliver it in a timely basis, the fleet purchaser has 3 months to use that voucher to purchase a similar HVIP eligible vehicle from an alternate vendor. Any funds not utilized would roll into the next round of voucher requests. Thank you for your consideration.
Thanks, Fraser.
So I know maybe I'm going in a little bit too deep on some of these questions, but this is one that I think is important. I just want to make a quick point on this because we've heard a couple of comments about vehicle delivery timelines, and that is an especially important point here. It is a little bit different, as we've talked about before, when we're talking about advanced technologies that in some cases are in low production volumes. And what we've seen in the market, especially for early market entrants, is that there are often unpredictable and unanticipated things that happen in the production cycle that can delay a delivery. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody did anything wrong or that the manufacturer is not doing everything they can to deliver the product. It means that somewhere along the way, there was somebody in the supply chain that couldn't meet the demand, or they had to change a supplier for a particular part. Those kinds of things happen. And I think what we're trying to distinguish is when there's a reasonable effort on the part of the manufacturer to bring that vehicle to market, where it's nearing completion, where it's most of the way along the assembly line or the assembly process, but it's not quite ready to be delivered yet. I think what we've experienced is that there needs to be some flexibility in situations like that, as opposed to a situation where an order is placed with the manufacturer and nothing happens from that point forward. That's clearly a different situation than reasonable efforts being made to deliver the vehicle and there's a delay somewhere along the line. So that's part of what we're trying to balance with this program as we're looking at the different policy options.
Yeah, the other part of that, and this ties to a previous question, is about monitoring, making decisions on the validity of vouchers before we issue them if we can. So offering flexibility on the back end after a voucher has already been approved and a vehicle is under construction, that's really important to provide that flexibility, as Peter was just saying. But we also want to be careful about there being like very serious consequences. While we can cancel vouchers at any time. That's not something that we want to do. And I don't think any manufacturer would want us to be liberally using that ability. That can be very deleterious, very damaging to the companies that we rely on, and who in most circumstances do end up developing and flourishing. We've seen so many companies come to HFIP as startups and develop into very successful enterprises. That's what we want to encourage.
Right, thank you. The next question comes from Michael McDonald. Would a simple solution to grant more flexibility to customers trying to go green be to have customers own HVIP responsibility rather than the reliance on a particular OEM/dealer to go through the process? Many customers want to try multiple manufacturers and are in that weird in-between of pilot and fleet level procurement. And so letting them manage the voucher process would allow them to decide where to put that money, where they need, and move it around as they see, versus reliance on OEMs to manage HVIPs.
Yeah, that's a great question. So HVIP is really set apart from a lot of the other incentive programs by its accessibility, how easy it is to use. The whole point is that for fleets, especially ones that are not like the early adopters, very tech savvy fleets that were interested with zero emission from the very beginning, that they have a simple solution, a simple way to get that upfront incremental cost buy down through HVIP. The reason why it works really is that we move all of the mechanisms of HVIP to the back end, that it's the dealer. So we only have to train as many dealers in the state as want to participate in HVIP. We don't have to train every single fleet to use what ends up being a somewhat complicated system on the back end. So we think it's really important that it remains very simple and easy for fleets to access the funding, and we keep all of the mechanisms on the dealer and back.
Thank you. Let's go back to those with raised hands for a bit, and then we'll come back to Q&A after a couple of folks have had a chance to speak with raised hands. I think we may have inadvertently muted Matt Schrapp before he had finished with all of his questions. So let's start with Matt.
Hi, Matt. Okay,
Hi.
you are now unmuted.
Thank you. I figured that was by design, to be honest, but that's okay. So thank you, Peter, again on that natural gas explanation. I just wanted to clear the air, if you will, on that bullet point. So some suggestions relative to the dealers, especially. As a participating dealer in HVIP for many years, Velocity has gone through and processed hundreds and processed and delivered hundreds of these applications and vehicles. So we're very familiar with it. We think it's a great program. Our customers have truly benefited from it. But some suggestions, and since this possibly is a good time to take a look at some of the procedural stuff and how HVIP functions, as it will be going back, potentially there might be an opportunity for some discussion along this end, where the ARB is being more, I guess, they're trying to help understand whether or not a fleet is in compliance. But if a fleet goes through the motions in HVIP, gets approved, and then the ARB does a DMV check on their compliance, once the vehicle already has been delivered and the dealer then has a shortfall, we're waiting then on the HVIP to pay us as a dealer. But unbeknownst sometimes to the fleet, they don't even know that there might be a vehicle that's registered in DMV rules still that might be appearing non-compliant, which will delay the process or possibly even preclude them from getting funding. So some type of front-end ARB check through the DMV prior to it reaching the final stage would help with some of the certainty, and also allowing fleets, if they want to purchase the vehicle and pay for the vehicle 100% themselves, like some government agencies are able to do within HVIP, allow private businesses, if they want to do that, to allow them that process, to not necessarily cut that off. And, I know this is on the funding side of things, but I thought it might be an appropriate place to bring up some of those concepts. So that would be it. Thank you again.
Okay, thanks.
Matt.
So,
Hey,
go
before we move on to the next one, just a quick note on compliance, and thanks Matt for both of those points. On compliance, it is extremely important to ARB that we're providing incentives to fleets and businesses that are in compliance with rules and regulations. And as you know, Matt, we have an extensive effort to make sure that that's the case for every single voucher that we approve and that we ultimately disperse funding for. So we do everything we can at the initial voucher request to make sure that the fleet is in compliance before the voucher is approved. There's a compliance check process that we go through at that point, but recognizing that very often it takes a long period of time between the time that the order is placed, when we know who the fleet is, and when the vehicle is actually delivered. There's usually a compliance check prior to dispersing funds as well. So in the case where we do run into a compliance issue at that point, at the point of vehicle delivery, where the vehicle's already been manufactured and there's already an investment on the part of the dealership and the manufacturer to make that happen, we recognize that, and we have a process in place to make sure that the dealership is not being held accountable for what is really a fleet compliance issue. But we're continuing to refine that process, and as we can, find opportunities to make it better, we will certainly do that. But at the end of the day, it's critically important for us to make sure that we're providing incentives, not to fleets that are out of compliance with rules and regulations, but to those that are doing everything they can to make sure that they stay in compliance.
Okay, thanks. So the next person, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name, but Anjali Deodhar, I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute and begin speaking, and please make sure to state your affiliation.
Thank you. Not a problem with the name. You actually got it almost right. Anjali Deodhar. I'm with Biotech Incorporated, and I had just a couple of comments to make. Things that we find as a startup and a small manufacturer, the few things that we would really like to encourage and get behind. And one of the things was, of course, the manufacturing rolling caps. I believe this assists smaller and newer technologies, the likes of which we are a huge part of. So that's definitely encouraging, and we find that extremely positive. There was a comment earlier from one of the folks who was questioning about tying voucher amounts to benefits. And I apologize if I've missed a discussion on what the benefits and the criteria for such benefits would be. But the only point that I would like to make here is we found effectively in a lot of transportation related decisions, miles-based criteria tend to start becoming extremely important. And I would like to point out that worksite operations-based criteria would also be something that should get taken into account, because otherwise these tend to hurt EPTO, APU manufacturers like ourselves. And EPTO is a huge part of HVIP right now, so we want to put that point in there. There's a lot that's been said about timeline to deployment, and other than to say that prioritizing technologies that are ready now rather than tying up voucher funds in technologies that have larger lead times attached to them is of course something that we would definitely encourage and get behind. And my final point is graduating non-plug-in systems is definitely an extremely positive recommendation, and we would encourage it wholeheartedly. So those were the 3 or 4 things that I wanted to highlight. Thanks for the time. Thank you to CARB staff for giving the opportunity. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Jamie Levin. I have enabled your mic, so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Okay, hey, thanks, Peter and Matt. So let me add a couple of suggestions. To start out with, let me add to what Tim Sassine spoke of earlier in terms of evaluating the value of HVIPs based on emission benefits. And of course, that would lend itself to our overall regulatory and targets and goals for zero emission. And so I think that's very important, but I'd like to add another angle on this, and that would be valuing HVIPs based on performance capabilities. And I've emphasized this in the pilot programs and other discussions, and I think this is very relevant to the specific application of the different types of vehicles as it relates to the end user, fleet operator, and what they value. And so that would be really three categories. One is range or maybe hours. Some of the vehicle types don't really depend on distance as much as hours of operation. The second really critical performance criteria would be payload. And that payload should be measured either in case of transit, number of passengers, so it's the difference between curb weight and gross vehicle weight, or for sure in freight, it's the payload. It's the amount of freight that can be carried in terms of ton miles. And thirdly is evaluation of the duty cycle and the throughput. In a 24-hour period or an operating period, how many people or how much freight can be moved? What's the basis of accommodating the duty cycle? I really think you ought to be looking at those three criteria, and where those benefit a particular vehicle type in terms of fleet operator requirements, you should value those HVIPs at a higher value. And that would be one way of allocating, scarce resources. And then I wanted to just touch on infrastructure. Of course, chicken and the egg is the question of, if you award HVIP funding for vehicles, is the infrastructure there? Is the infrastructure being financed or made available? And this, of course, deals with the disparities that we see between hydrogen and battery charging access to funds. So I think you need to be looking at where is the infrastructure funding going to come from and how is that going to support? And then to touch on what you said, Peter, I think scalability is another basis for evaluating performance. So we're seeing in the transit market, as transit agencies are now asking and moving forward with procuring fuel cell vehicles to complement battery electric, that they're looking to not just build infrastructure for a small number of vehicles, but for a large number of vehicles to be able to expand. So in that regard, if you had an HVIP application in which they brought to the table infrastructure that could accommodate a significant expansion beyond what they may be requesting immediately for HVIP funding, but the ability to grow their fleets because they have infrastructure, that ought to be a value added in your consideration of an award of HVIP vouchers. Thank you.
Matt, I don't know if you want to address any of that, but it's interesting because we've had a couple of suggestions that we look at the, I think in most of the cases, the voucher amount, and I'm distinguishing the voucher amount from vehicle eligibility. But I think we've had a couple of suggestions that we look at the voucher amount based on different criteria, looking at payload capacity, or looking at the range, zero emission range, or looking at other factors, performance factors that are associated with the vehicle. And I think that's a potential option, but it's fundamentally different than what Matt was running through at the beginning of the presentation, which are the guiding principles that we're considering for HVIP that build off of the original guiding principles from the original AQIP program. That's really one of the things that makes HVIP unique and sets it apart from the other funding options that are in the portfolio, which is really focusing on influencing that purchase decision. So what is the amount of funding that it takes to encourage a fleet to decide to purchase an advanced technology vehicle instead of what they would have purchased otherwise? So that's not necessarily related to the range of the vehicle or to how many they're planning to buy in the near future or anything like that, but it has been really what we've been focusing on since the inception of HVIP in terms of looking at that incentive amount and making sure that we're not providing more funding than necessary to influence that purchase decision. I mean, frankly, administering a public funding program with this perspective in mind, that we want that voucher amount to be as low as possible and still have the fleet purchase the vehicle. So if we can provide an incentive at $50,000 and the fleet is going to purchase that vehicle based on all of the factors that go into that purchase decision from a fleet perspective, total cost of ownership, maintenance support, all the factors that go along with that. If it takes $50,000 to incentivize that purchase, we don't want to pay $50,001, even if it meets other criteria or if it would be cost effective. It's really about influencing that purchase decision. And I've already forgotten the other part of your comment, Jamie, but I'm hoping that Matt is tracking it. He can back me up on this.
Yeah, I might be able to. So really summarized in fewer words, what Peter was saying is that setting HVIP vouchers is all about not enough or too far. There's always a balance between getting the vouchers right and adding complexity to the program. You know, if we're to prioritize simplicity, then some of the different ways of setting voucher amounts won't align with that. With infrastructure, you hit a good point that, you know, one of the things we want to support and advocate for is scale, both in vehicles and in the infrastructure. Those are things that we want to support and we want to help fleets do. But there could be an equity issue introduced when we set that as a decider for a voucher amount that would then drive a purchase decision that would allow us to issue an incentive. And I thought immediately about fleets that happen to be lucky enough to be in an IOU territory where there's a broad and easily accessible infrastructure investment program from the IOU. They have much easier access to support for their infrastructure than fleets that are outside of that. And we don't want to artificially end up diverting more voucher funding to fleets that are lucky by simply their geography. So we have to consider all of these things. There's a lot of complexity. There's also a lot of time for us to continue having these conversations into the future. HVIP is not a static program. It is constantly changing. The public process doesn't end either. Even after we go to the board, every single year is more of thinking about how can HVIP be better. So while I want to raise some of my initial concerns with some of these ideas, I don't want to put them down, because we want to hear more of these ideas about how HVIP can improve and how HVIP can be better at creating the change that it's set out to create. So thank you for bringing them up.
Okay, thanks. Next we have Irvi Negrani. Irvi, I have enabled your mic so that you can begin speaking.
Hey there. I really appreciate both Peter and Matt's comments just now about the goals of HVIP being to incentivize a purchase decision. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that because there have been such a large number of orders placed using HVIP, there's a lot of other folks who are dependent on that incentive to get into the marketplace where they need that incentive. And there's manufacturers who are larger and able to now point to previous successes and say, yes, this works, and could make that sale without HVIP. And so I think a sort of rolling manufacturer cap would be appropriate, because, you know, a company like Tesla or Proterra, once they've sold the first 200, 300 units, they're going to inherently have better market and dealer acceptance than a small manufacturer who needs to get those initial commercial successes so that they've got case studies to take to the market and to take to investors to acquire private funds to begin to scale up. So I think when we're thinking about the benefit to California, having something like a rolling manufacturer cap does provide a benefit. The other thing which I do think is important to note is, since we don't know how long COVID is going to go, I think there should be priority given to businesses that were qualified in the essential operations at all tiers of California's operational guidelines. So something that's considered an essential business when we're in purple and will be continuing to operate throughout the year regardless of what is going on should maybe get the incentive first than something that isn't going to be open until we're down in the yellow or green again. Because realistically, we're going to be dealing with COVID at least for the next fiscal year. There's no health assessment that says we won't. And so making sure that businesses can get those revenues and do deployments of the vehicles that'll actually be used in this time will expedite those air quality benefits to California, while at the same time supporting the businesses that will be necessary to cut emissions during this time.
Thanks, Irvi. I always think about timing when there's suggestions of things like this. So, consider that we're talking about funding and policy for HVIP that starts in 2021, probably Q1, and that on average, from program opening to voucher request and approval, all the way to vehicle delivery, 12 to 18 months. We're in 2022, like mid 2022. So does it make sense still to have a system that gears HVIP towards businesses whose status will continue to change over time, and who the vehicles for which may be delivered well after a vaccine is widespread and COVID is whatever is over?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I have not seen a single credible health thing that says a vaccine will be widely available prior to 2022, even if one is initially developed, because scaling and manufacturing. So the reality is, whether it's here, whether it's in China, whether it's in India, we're seeing COVID expansion globally mean that the types of vehicles that will be able to be deployed and cut emissions are the ones that are going to be able to survive shutdowns. And so we know that there are certain types of vehicles that are being used more, whether that's, medical, whether that's essential infrastructure, whether that's deliveries of food, that are going to be used significantly more than, for example, a parked school bus, which is, school's not in session. It's not going to be used right now. And so if we're looking at, the short term of orders placed in Q1, if that both essential businesses and essential business suppliers are allowed to operate under the purple. And so if you're not supplying an essential business, you're not allowed to be out there manufacturing right now. And so even if you're talking about dollars going out in 2021 Q1, the essential businesses, because of that flow through provision of suppliers of essential businesses are allowed to operate, would be able to supply a vehicle faster than a non-essential.
This is, I think we can pick this up offline. I think there's a lot of considerations in that, but I'll reach out to you, Irvi.
Okay, next up we have Nicholas Chavez. Nicholas, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking. Please state your affiliation.
Hi, this is Nicholas Chavez on behalf of the School Transportation Coalition and the California Association of School Transportation Officials. With any changes to HVIP, we ask that you maintain school bus eligibility. We ask that, changes, whether it be vehicle weight or any other changes, that school buses be considered in that thought of the changes. We can't thank CARB, the local air districts, and the Energy Commission for their commitment to replacing the many old buses throughout the state. But I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight how large the fleet is, roughly 25,000 school buses throughout the state. And with the last report a few years ago, it was highlighted how many of those that were still in need of replacement. And with it, with the electric buses, the cost compared to what school districts are used to with the diesel and natural gas buses, that cost difference is quite immense. And so maintaining that incentive for purchase is going to be really important going forward as we try and tackle the older buses on the road And just to address one of the previous comments, school buses are still getting older every year, no matter if we're in COVID or we're not in COVID. And so when the kids do get back on those school buses, we don't want to be in the same place that we were 2 years ago, with the school buses being old and being detrimental to the students' health. So I don't agree with the idea of putting students' health on pause when these school buses are getting older and older every year, COVID or out of COVID. So thank you so much for the comments. For the time, and thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, we recognize the importance of funding for school buses, and we continue to work with the Energy Commission and the air districts, and we're thrilled to see their continued support for electric school buses. And Nick, would it be all right if I reached out to you to learn a little bit more about the cost differences between internal combustion engine and zero emission school buses?
Absolutely.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I want to put another question out there too, and Nicholas, you don't have to respond to this here, but maybe this is a question that I want to ask you to think about a little bit and then follow up with us. And I would pose the same question to our friends in the transit industry as well, because both transit buses and school buses have a couple of commonalities. One is that they're essentially entirely publicly funded, and the other is that HVIP really doesn't provide the majority of the funding for either one of those bus types. In every case, they're combined with funding from other public funding sources to fund those buses. The transit side, it's FTA and some local funding and maybe some other funding sources. And on the school bus side, we've had a lot of great partnerships with the air districts, and in some cases local funding as well to fully fund those school buses. But here's the question. Recognizing that we're not funding most of the cost of the bus in most cases, and that we're always combining HVIP funds with other funding sources, part of what's on the table today for discussion is reducing voucher amounts. And I know that you'd probably say today that you'd prefer that we not reduce funding amounts for school buses or transit buses. But I just wonder if ultimately that would result in fewer clean buses on the road, because is it possible that some of the other funding sources don't have the same level of fiscal crisis or funding restriction that HVIP faces in this upcoming year? Because if it's possible for other funding sources, if they're fully funded or at least have a better funding picture than HVIP does, to be able to continue to fund buses, the number of buses that we need to get out there, it might actually make sense for HVIP to reduce some of those voucher amounts, consistent with how we're looking at voucher reductions from the other vehicle classes as well. So what I'm trying to say is, it might initially look like it's a big impact to reduce an HVIP voucher amount for a school bus or a transit bus, but might that actually help to get more clean buses deployed in this upcoming year, recognizing this kind of very unique circumstances of the fiscal picture from the different funding sources out there? So initial thoughts on that now would be fine, but I'd really more ask folks to think about that and follow up with us in the near future.
Absolutely, and I'd love to follow up with you in the future. So some initial thoughts on that, just with the school bus fleet in the larger picture. Prop 1B was a really big influx in school bus replacement, but the years after that running out and until the recent influx over the past 5 or 6 years of school bus replacement funding, there was a big gap, and with the funding at school districts the way it is, they're having enough time just keeping the routes going for each school district, with a lot of them having to reduce those routes just to the special needs, which is state mandated. So the funding picture overall for school bus replacement has been, it hasn't been enough throughout the state. You know, we can't thank the commitment from the Air Resources Board and Energy Commission and the local districts for stepping up and really helping to reduce and really make that commitment to students' health. But you know, any reduction, you know, it will have some impact on how many school buses are replaced, and it'll be tough to get those to meet those goals of getting those school buses off the road that have been an afterthought for so many years. But I'd love to hear more about the other funding sources that you mentioned, and I'd love to talk to you offline.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next up we have Ryan Kenny. Ryan, I have enabled your mic, so, oh, Ryan just left. So next up is Kinshuk Chatterjee. I apologize if I have mispronounced your name, but I have unmuted you so you can begin speaking. You'll need to unmute your mic.
Yes, hello. I think I unmuted by accident, so apologies, but you can go on to the next person.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, next up we have Eileen Tutt. Eileen, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Hi, thank you. This is Eileen Tutt with the California Electric Transportation Coalition. I want to highlight, I thought that the performance or the guiding principles that Matt laid out, as Peter said, are one of the strengths of HFIP. And I am concerned about these various suggestions of different performance capabilities, and CARB or any of us trying to determine what an end user values. I think the beauty of these guiding principles that Matt laid out is that they allow the customer or the fleet to determine what end user value, what they themselves value. And I think that is the strength of HFIP. So I just want to give a shout out in support of the HFIP program as it stands, and really caution against any of these, our own determination of what is valued by users, and allowing the users themselves, because these applications, the trucking applications, there's such a huge variety in what they need, and what is valuable to one may not be valuable to another. And so I just think it's very important to stick with what we've got and what works so well, almost too well, you might argue. And then I also want to just suggest that I think, I'm always dismayed by this kind of tension between hydrogen and battery electric vehicles. I just think that both have different end user values, right? And we should let customers decide what they want and not argue amongst the stakeholders about which is better, because they're both really good for the environment. They both help meet CARB's needs. And so I would just caution against getting into these sort of meaningless fights between ourselves about which one's better, because there is no one that's better. They're both good and we need them both. And so I wish that would kind of end. But on the battery electric side, I just want to just kind of clarify that there is a tremendous need for an infrastructure build out for these zero emission battery electric trucks. And so there is I will say there is kind of a, the grid itself is built out not just in California, but across the nation and in fact most of the world. And so the battery electrics have that advantage, and I'm not going to deny that. You just have to hook up to an already existing infrastructure that's ubiquitous. So there is a value there, and we can't deny that, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to focus on making sure that entities that want to connect to the grid to charge their battery electric trucks have access to that last mile, if you will, infrastructure. And so I think the utilities are eager to work with these customers, and CARB has been incredibly helpful with connecting the utilities to these customers. And they want to make these incentives that are available through CEC available to their customers for this infrastructure. But they also are doing that in a very, very intentional way. I mean, the way that we connect this transportation resources to the grid has grid benefits and for all electricity users, whether or not you drive an electric truck or a car. So I think there is this real intentional build out that we're all working towards. And I think that we need to continue to work towards that. It is a challenge. So I don't want, I worry about the suggestion that somehow, we don't need to spend as much time on battery electric infrastructure, electricity fuel infrastructure as we do on hydrogen. I think that both require our attention, both require funding, and there is not, again, I'd like to I would love it if we could just remove that tension and recognize that there's not enough money. None of us are going to get enough money. And CARB and the Energy Commission are really doing, I think, a fabulous job of trying to walk a tightrope that it's almost certain they're going to fall off of. And so I want to congratulate you. And I just want to urge all of us to be just thoughtful about how we talk about the zero emission vehicle technologies. And I do support graduating ICE vehicles. I think the time is right. I think we've been investing in those vehicles for decades. And it's just kind of time now to shift. And I think the governor's executive order puts a particular burden on CARB, and it's a good burden. We welcome that burden, but it puts a burden on CARB and all of us to make greater investments in zero emission, clean air, greenhouse gas reductions. And that's what CARB's trying to do here. So I support that graduation as hard as I think it is to make that decision.
Thank you, Eileen. From this point forward, there shall be no tension. Andrea, do you have an announcement to make?
I do have a quick announcement for everyone. So we are approaching our end time, which is at 1 p.m., and we have a couple last slides to go over on next steps and such. So we are well into the time where you can certainly be asking questions and providing comments on things beyond HVIP, anything that you heard today. But we recognize that we're probably not going to be able to make it to everyone's question or comment today. So to that end, we'll continue taking questions from folks who have their hands raised, but you are more than welcome to type questions into the Q&A box, and CARB staff will see those questions and comments and consider them. And we'll certainly have contact information available on the last slide so that you can reach out if you would like to speak with us one-on-one. All right, so Lisa, if you could help us get the next speaker up.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. Ryan Kenny, I see that you are back. So I have enabled your mic. You can begin speaking.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Ryan Kenny with Clean Energy. Hello, Peter, Matt, Lisa, and Michelle. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for your time. Just a couple quick points and then a question. I think many of us in the low NOx industries are very we understand very much the budget crunch that's happening, and we of course don't dispute the numbers in large part, but it still, I think, doesn't absolve ARB of the responsibility to focus and address near-term emission reductions, and that's partly of what ARB is responsible for doing. And I think the EO, the executive order that the governor issued a couple of days ago, also is more long-term focused and didn't really address any near-term focus. And that's, I think, where the low NOx industries are focused on today with HVIP. And I think there's overwhelming empirical evidence that both VW and Carl Moyer are broken, and they're not really driving low NOx truck adoption. And if you need more information, I think our industries can definitely provide that. But the programmatic constraints just don't drive the adoption. And that really leaves HVIP as really the only workable program. So I would just ask that the discussion draft be amended, that it's not an or but an and, that it focus on graduation and a landing spot. And that was largely the conversation last year, as you recall, where can we put low NOx out of HVIP once it graduates? And if it's going to go out of HVIP and not have a landing spot, then we think diesel is going to be the vehicle of choice for fleets. So I'm just wondering if this team is considering a landing spot like last year, and also if so, is there a bureaucratic discussion between the Carl Moyer team and this team to really get that right? Because right now those programs are broken, and we've, as an industry, given some suggestions. They just haven't gone through. So I just wanted to see if discussions are taking place. Can we work on this? Can we get this done and have a landing spot for low NOx trucks? Thank you.
Hey Ryan, thanks for the comments and the question. And just to address the very last part first, yes, we are always coordinating with the Moyer staff, all the other incentive program staff, regulatory staff. Those are all ongoing conversations. We stay closely coordinated. In terms of, I've heard this comment a couple of times now, Moyer being broken. I find that really hard to believe. Moyer, the Carl Moyer program, the full name, just to give Carl Moyer a little bit of credit, is the Carl Moyer Memorial Air Quality Standards Attainment Program. Been around since 1999. One of the most successful programs, longest standing program in California. And it has provided funding for thousands of projects across the entire state, administered by the air districts, and I think has been a tremendous success. Low NOx engines, as well as many other technology types, are available today. Funding is available today, and low NOx also has higher cost effectiveness limits. So it may not be as easy as HVIP. It never will be as easy as HVIP, because the Moyer program is really designed to achieve SIP reductions. So those near-term reductions that you're talking about is really what the Carl Moyer program was designed to do. But I think, so from that standpoint, I think there is a portfolio of funding out there, including the VW funding that's available for low NOx engines. Whether we would reconsider graduating low NOx, I think the facts are clear on that. Cummins Westport makes a great product. The natural gas engine that they have on the market today is better than any other engine that's been produced in the early days. It meets the needs of fleets. It hauls heavy loads. It's used in Class 8 operations, and it really provides reliable service. It's a great engine out there, and I think folks, I think the fleets should take a close look at that as an opportunity. Pulls an 80,000-pound load, right? The other things that we looked at, this goes back to the conversation that we had last year about, is this technology ready to graduate? And we think it is. We thought it was last year, but I think the board recognized that there weren't a lot of zero-emission Class 8 trucks approved in HVIP, and so we continued funding those in the last year. But Cummins Westport has sold over 80,000 of those engines. Not all low NOx; those are some of the earlier generation. But fundamentally, a natural gas engine with a three-way catalyst, supported by over 100 public access heavy-duty fueling stations in California, with support from other opportunities within that CARB portfolio, like the low carbon fuel standard, which really helps to reduce a lot of the ongoing costs and provide that total cost of ownership that makes good business sense to look at a natural gas vehicle today. So I think from that standpoint, plus looking at the fact that with a $45,000 incentive from HVIP, most of that, if not all of that, the vast majority of that funding is paying for the CNG tank. It's not paying for an advanced technology component on that vehicle, and the CNG tanks have been around for a long time, for decades. So I think for those reasons, maybe not an exhaustive list, but probably exhausting enough for today, that is what we're considering for the recommendation for this funding plan.
Okay, next up we have Nico. Nico, I have enabled your mic so you can unmute and begin speaking.
Oh, this is Nico Bouwkamp with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. I assume you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So I typed my questions in the Q&A box. So if I need to stop talking, then let me know. You have my questions. So in the context of accelerating market transformation in this program and motivate additional investment, what lessons learned from rolling out HIP vehicles and the implementation of the supporting fueling infrastructure may need financial support? And this is a broad question, not just one specific program, because obviously I did mention HVIP vehicle rollout, but it's across the board from the beginning of this meeting till now. That's the first question. And the second question is, out of curiosity, how will CARB support the consistency of the fueling interface for heavy-duty ZEVs? I heard the comments about it's up to the industry, true, but if CARB it plays a role in it going in a certain direction, it'd be good to hear what CARB's thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Hey, Nico, I'm going to attempt to answer both of those questions very quickly. With the first one, it's honestly exactly what you think. The costs are where you know they are. There have been no groundbreaking discoveries, but I would recommend that you look at the infrastructure case studies that are in the long-term heavy-duty investment strategy this year for a little more. And please, please, please reach out to me if you have any questions on that, or on the second part of your question, which is connector standardization for battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. That is something that CARB continues to participate in, but we have not decided to take an active role in that. That, of course, is always subject to change, and we welcome you reaching out and connecting with us on that. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. Unfortunately, we are just about to time. So we do really appreciate everyone participating in this conversation today. I'm just gonna run over a few quick next steps and a summary of what we discussed today. So today marked the end of a series of work groups and workshops that have been happening since January. As a quick reminder, our schedule has shifted. We anticipate releasing the proposed funding plan in November, and it will then be open for a formal 30-day public comment period. We anticipate that the board will consider the funding plan at the December 10th and 11th board meeting. We know we did not get to every question that was asked and was in the Q&A box today. So if you would like to have a conversation about any of those questions or discuss anything you heard today with CARB staff, you are more than welcome to contact me or contact project staff directly to set up a time to talk. Note that since most staff are working remotely, email is the fastest way to reach us. So with that, thank you all for attending today's workshop and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.